Lenora Vance set down her teacup with the particular kind of deliberateness that meant she wanted everyone in Harwick's general store to hear what she was about to say. Well, she let the word sit there a moment, let it breathe. Let the three women gathered near the fabric bolts turn their heads toward her. I saw her stepping off that train yesterday. Another pause. She smoothed her glove along her wrist. Gideon Rourke has lost his mind entirely. That woman is enormous. I mean truly, genuinely enormous. He could have had any widow in the territory. He could have had a young girl from Cheyenne, and he sends away to Nebraska and gets... She gestured vaguely with one gloved hand as though the words were almost too distasteful to finish. That. The laughter was quiet. Carefully quiet. The kind of laughter women use when they want to be cruel but maintain the appearance of being merely honest. Mabel Sutter was standing 6 feet away behind a shelf of canned goods. She had heard every word. If you love stories about ordinary women who refuse to stay small no matter what the world tells them, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. And if Mabel's story already has your heart, tap that like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The train had been 3 days late out of Omaha. Mabel Sutter had spent those 3 extra days sitting in a hard wooden seat watching Nebraska flatten itself into Wyoming, watching the sky grow bigger and the trees grow scarcer, watching everything familiar about her life disappear behind her 1 mile at a time. She had her good dress on, the dark blue wool, the one she'd let out twice in the past 4 years and refused to feel shame about, and her hair pinned back so tight it gave her a headache, and her one decent traveling trunk stowed in the luggage car with everything she owned in the world packed inside it. She was 33 years old, and she was riding toward a man she had never met. That fact had not frightened her until about an hour outside of Harwick, Wyoming, when it suddenly frightened her considerably. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass and watched the land go by and told herself what she'd been telling herself for 6 weeks, since the letter from the Hartwell Matrimonial Agency had arrived at the boarding house in Lincoln where she'd been cooking for 12 men since her mother died. She told herself she was practical. She told herself she was capable. She told herself that a man who read her letters and still wrote back, not once but 4 times, increasingly longer letters, letters that asked real questions, was a man worth the risk of a train ticket. And then she told herself to stop shaking her left knee before the woman across the aisle noticed. Mabel Sutter had spent her entire life being noticed for the wrong things. She knew what she looked like. She had known since she was 11 years old, and a boy at the schoolhouse in Cass County called her a word she would not repeat, and the other children laughed, and her mother pulled her home by the hand and said, very quietly, "You are smarter than every one of those children, and smart lasts longer than pretty, and don't you forget it." Her mother had been right. Mabel was smarter. She kept books for the boarding house at 16, managed the household budget at 19, could stretch $1 further than most men could stretch 3. She could cook in a way that made grown men go quiet and thoughtful, the way good food does when it hits something deeper than hunger. But she was a large woman, a very large woman, round-faced and broad-shouldered, with a heavy waist and thick hands, and a body that frontier society looked at and decided, before she opened her mouth, that it knew everything worth knowing about her. She had written Gideon Rourke the honest letter because she was tired of pretending. She had answered his agency advertisement in March because a woman alone in Lincoln with no family and 12 boarders who had no obligation to keep her on past spring had limited options and unlimited stubbornness. She'd read the advertisement twice. Widower, 42, 12,000 acres, seeks capable woman for marriage and household management, must be willing to relocate to Wyoming territory. She'd written back the same day. Not a flattering letter, not a letter that performed sweetness or modesty or delicacy. A letter that listed, very plainly, what she could do. She kept accounts. She managed larders and budgets. She cooked. Really cooked. Not merely assembled things on a stove. She was not afraid of hard work or cold winters or animals larger than herself. And then, because she was Mabel Sutter, and she had never seen any percentage in letting a man be surprised by what he was getting, she had written the sentence that kept her awake for 2 nights after she sent it. "I should be plain with you about one thing, Mr. Rourke. I am not a small woman. I am not a pretty woman. I am what frontier people would call heavyset, or worse, depending on their generosity. I know what men expect when they seek a wife. I am telling you honestly what you would find at the other end of that train ticket, so that no one's time is wasted. She had waited 3 weeks for his reply and been certain it wouldn't come. It came on a Thursday, 2 pages in a plain hand, no flourishes. Miss Sutter, I appreciate plain speaking. I have had enough of the other kind to last me. I am not looking for decoration. I am looking for a woman who can make a household run and who will not fall apart when Wyoming tries her patience, which it will, regularly. Your letter tells me you are that woman. Come to Wyoming if you're willing. I will meet the train. She'd read it 4 times. Then she wrote back and said she'd come. And now the train was pulling into Harwick, and Mabel was standing up before it fully stopped, grabbing her traveling bag from the overhead rack and telling herself one more time that she was practical and capable and not at all afraid. She was lying about the last part. The platform was cold despite it being early May, the Wyoming wind doing what Wyoming wind does to people's expectations. Mabel stepped down from the train car and immediately felt it. Not the cold, but the looking. A dozen people on that platform and half of them glancing at her with the particular expression she had spent her life cataloging. The expression that started at her face, moved downward, and arrived at a conclusion before circling back up with something carefully neutral layered over the top. She set her jaw and looked for the man from the letters. She found him because he was the only man on the platform, not pretending to look elsewhere. Gideon Rourke was leaning against a post near the luggage car with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and he was looking directly at her without any of the elaborate pretending. He was a tall man, lean in the way that outdoor work makes men lean, with a weathered face and a jaw that had clearly never wasted time on frivolous expressions. He looked like exactly what his letters had sounded like, plain and direct and not particularly interested in softening anything. He was staring at her. Mabel felt her stomach drop straight through the platform boards. Here it is, she thought. He's calculating how to do this politely. He's working out the words. She had prepared for this. She'd prepared the gracious exit speech. I understand completely, Mr. Rourke. No explanation necessary. I'll find my own way back to the station. She had it ready like a thing she'd sewn into her coat lining. Emergency provisions. Gideon Rourke pushed off from the post and walked toward her. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough that Mabel's prepared speech started climbing toward her throat. Then he said, That your trunk in the luggage car? Mabel blinked. The brown one with the brass latches. He nodded once and walked past her toward the luggage car. That was it. That was the whole of it. Mabel stood on the platform in the Wyoming wind and watched Gideon Rourke collect her trunk from the luggage handler without being asked, without commentary, without the speech she'd been bracing for. And she felt something strange and uncomfortable happen in her chest, something that felt almost exactly like hope, which she mistrusted entirely, because hope had made a fool of her before. She picked up her traveling bag and followed him to the wagon. He did not help her up into it. She didn't expect him to, and she didn't need it. And when she climbed up herself and settled her considerable weight onto the bench without incident, she caught him watching from the corner of her eye with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. They drove out of Harwick in silence that lasted a full 10 minutes. Then Gideon said without looking at her, You write better letters than most men I've done business with. Mabel said, I've had more practice than most men. He glanced at her sideways. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. What kind of practice? Managing accounts? Writing purchase orders? Communicating with suppliers who don't listen unless you're very precise? She looked at the road ahead. Men mostly don't listen unless things are written down plainly, and the room for misunderstanding is removed entirely. That's accurate, Gideon said. I know it is. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Still quiet, but with a different quality to it. She looked at the ranch when they arrived and felt the size of it like a physical thing. The main house was large, a 2-story structure that had the look of something built by a man who'd had money before he'd had anyone to spend it on. Solid and practical and completely without charm. Outbuildings stretched in several directions. Cattle were visible at the far boundary of a pasture. 3 ranch hands stopped what they were doing to look at the wagon coming in, and Mabel watched them do the same thing the platform had done. The assessment, the conclusion, the careful neutral surface layered on top. One of them, a young man with sun-reddened ears, said something to the one beside him. The second man laughed. He turned it into a cough when Gideon's eyes landed on him, but it was too late and everyone knew it. Gideon set the wagon brake and got down. He looked at the young man with the red ears for a moment that had no expression in it at all, and the young man suddenly found something very urgent to do with his boot. Mabel climbed down herself. Gideon said, "I'll show you the house." Inside was worse. Not because it was dirty. It was clean enough in the way that spaces maintained entirely by men who consider cleanliness a functional rather than aesthetic matter tend to be clean. Everything was in order and nothing was comfortable. The kitchen was large and had clearly not been used for real cooking in years. There were supplies stocked without logic, dried beans beside boot polish, flour stored in a damp corner, a side of salted pork hung where the air didn't circulate. Mabel walked through the kitchen with her traveling bag still on her arm and her mouth shut, because she was a guest here still, and she had not yet earned the right to reorganize anything. But she was cataloging. Gideon watched her look at everything without touching anything and said, "Mrs. Harriet Poole comes twice a week to clean. The cooking is mostly done by whoever isn't busy, which means it mostly doesn't get done properly." "That explains the flour," Mabel said. "What about the flour?" "It's stored against the north wall. In May, that's fine. Come August, you'll have weevils." Gideon looked at the flour sack, back at her. "How do you know that from looking at it?" "I've kept larder since I was 16, Mabel said. "I know what bad storage looks like the same way you probably know what sick cattle look like before they show symptoms." He considered that. "Fair enough." She was shown to a room upstairs, a spare room, clean, with a window that faced east and a quilt on the bed that had clearly been put there recently, still carrying the smell of a cedar chest. She set her traveling bag on the chair and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself breathe for the first time since Nebraska. She didn't know yet what this would be. But she was here. She had come this far. And she was not going back. She was in the kitchen at 5 the next morning, not because anyone asked her to be, because she had looked at that pantry the night before and spent half her sleep sorting through what she could make, from what was there and what was missing and what was going to go bad first if nobody paid attention to it. The salted pork was fine, but the dried onions had gotten moisture and needed using. There was cornmeal, and she found a crock of lard on a low shelf. There were eggs she had to hunt for behind a tin of axle grease, which told her a great deal about the organizational philosophy of whoever last stocked this kitchen. She built the fire herself, moved the flour to a better shelf, found a large cast iron skillet, and started. By 6:30 she had cornbread in the oven, salt pork frying, eggs scrambled with the dried onions rehydrated in a little hot water, and coffee strong enough to brace a person against Wyoming wind. She had also found the accounts ledger sitting on the kitchen sideboard, tucked between a harness catalog and an old almanac, and opened it while the bread baked. She was 3 pages into it before she realized she was doing exactly the things she'd told herself she wouldn't do on the first morning. She was already fixing things. The hands came in at 7, all 5 of them. They stopped in the doorway in a cluster the way men do when they encounter something unexpected, and Mabel turned from the stove and said, "Sit down, there's enough for everyone." Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then the oldest one, a gray-bearded man of about 50, who would later tell her his name was Vernon, said, "Yes, ma'am," and sat down, and the others followed because when Vernon moved, they moved. The young one with the red ears, she'd learned he was called Denny, 19 years old, the youngest on the crew, took a piece of cornbread, bit into it, and his expression did something involuntary that he clearly hadn't intended, something that was not cool skepticism. Mabel had seen that expression before on the faces of 12 boarding house men in Lincoln, and she knew what it meant. She turned back to the stove. Gideon came down at 7:15, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the table of men eating in near silence, the reverent silence that comes over people when the food is serious, and then looked at Mabel. She poured him coffee and set the cup on the table without ceremony. He sat down and ate, and didn't say anything for several minutes. Then he said, "That cornbread." He stopped. Started again. "My wife used to make cornbread." He set it to his plate. "I haven't tasted it right since." Mabel said, "The secret is the lard. People use butter now, and it's not the same." Gideon nodded slowly. "No, it's not." That was all. But it was enough. The town of Harwick was something she walked into 3 days later when Gideon needed supplies from the dry goods store and asked if she wanted to come. She said yes because she needed to understand the place if she was going to live in it. Harwick was not a large town. It had a main street with the necessary businesses, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church, a schoolhouse at the end of the road. It had the feel of a town that knew its own hierarchy and was comfortable with it. She could sense the weight of that hierarchy within the first 10 minutes, who nodded to whom, who waited for whom to enter a doorway first, which women clustered together and which ones stood slightly apart. She felt the moment word of her started moving down the street before she could see it happening. A woman she didn't know glanced at her outside the post office and then said something to the woman beside her. 2 men in front of the feed store looked over and then looked away in the way that meant they'd been looking. She was used to this. She had been used to this for 20 years. What she wasn't entirely prepared for was Lenora Vance. She encountered her in the dry goods store, which was crowded because Fridays in Harwick were market days. Lenora was a tall woman, elegant in the way that took money and effort and deliberate cultivation, with a hat that cost more than Mabel's entire traveling trunk and gloves that had never seen work. She was the wife of Harold Vance, who owned half the commercial real estate in Harwick, and whose opinion on local matters carried the kind of weight that came from owning things other people needed. Mabel had seen women like Lenora before. She understood them the way you understand weather patterns. Not personally, but as a system with predictable behavior. Lenora looked at her in the dry goods store and said, to the woman beside her, but loudly enough for the room, "Well, I'd heard, but I didn't quite believe it." She tilted her head. "She's very substantial, isn't she?" The room did its thing, became very interested in other things. Mabel did not stop moving. She went to the counter and gave the proprietor her supply list and waited while he filled it. She could feel Lenora watching. She did not turn around. "I wonder," Lenora said, same caring voice, "what Gideon Rourke is thinking. A man of his standing could have taken his pick from the territory. And instead, a small laugh, like a door closing gently. A mail-order arrangement from Nebraska." Mabel took her package from the counter and turned around. She looked at Lenora Vance directly. Lenora blinked. She hadn't expected to be looked at. Mabel said very pleasantly, "Good morning," and walked out of the store. She stood on the boardwalk in the Wyoming sun and held her package and made herself breathe slowly. Her face was hot. Her jaw ached from the effort of keeping it still. She had told herself on the train that it wouldn't matter, that she was done letting other people's opinions be the measuring stick for her worth. She had believed that, sitting on the train. She believed it right now about 70%, which was more than she'd had at 25, and she decided that 70% would have to be enough. She walked back to where Gideon had the wagon and loaded her supplies and didn't say anything. Gideon looked at her. "Lenora Vance?" Mabel looked up. "You know?" "I know Lenora," he said. "Same way I know what bad weather looks like before it shows symptoms." Mabel felt something loosen slightly behind her ribs. She climbed up into the wagon. "Is she always like that?" "Only when she feels threatened." Mabel looked at him. "Why would she feel threatened by me?" Gideon picked up the reins. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said it to the horses. "Because you came here and you didn't ask her permission first. Lenora Vance doesn't forgive that in other women." They drove back to the ranch without much more talking, but it was the kind of silence that wasn't empty. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Mabel learned the ranch the way she learned any new household, methodically, section by section, watching and listening before touching. She reorganized the pantry in the first week, quietly, while Gideon was out with the cattle. She moved the flour to the dry corner she'd identified. She rearranged the preserved goods so the oldest were in front. She found, in a dusty corner of the back storage room, 3 entire crates of dried fruit, apples, plums, pears, that had been purchased and forgotten about 2 winters ago. Some were still good. She also found, in the account's ledger, that someone had been ordering twice the quantity of coffee beans as the ranch could reasonably use, and that the notation for the excess was labeled simply sundries, which was the notation that meant, "I don't want to account for this carefully." She did not immediately say anything about the coffee. She kept a note and watched. She started cooking dinner properly. Real dinners, not the thrown-together affairs that Vernon told her had been the custom. Whatever was quickest, eaten without ceremony at different times. Mabel made dinner a set hour. She made things that required attention and time, because she had learned that food prepared with attention tasted different from food prepared with indifference, even when the ingredients were the same. The first dinner she made properly was a beef and vegetable stew that had simmered since 2 in the afternoon. The hands came in smelling it before they came through the door. Vernon sat down and put his hands flat on the table and closed his eyes when he tasted it. And Denny, who was 19 and thought himself too old for visible emotion, asked for a third bowl and then looked surprised at himself for asking. Gideon ate his portion and then sat at the table after the others had gone, with his coffee, not reading or doing anything in particular, just sitting. Mabel was washing up. She said without turning, "The stew was better this time because I found the dried thyme behind the boot polish." "I didn't know we had dried thyme," Gideon said. "You have all sorts of things you don't know about," Mabel said. "The pantry has been a disaster since, well, for a while." "Since Eleanor died," he said. 7 years. She turned then. He was looking at his coffee cup. "I'm sorry," she said. She was a good woman. He said it plainly, without performance. She kept the house properly. I didn't know how much work that was until it stopped. A pause. Or I knew and didn't think about it the way I should have. Mabel dried her hands on her apron. Most people don't think about what keeps a house standing until something falls. Gideon looked up at her. "Is that resentment?" "No," she said, and meant it. "It's just accurate." He nodded slowly. "Fair enough." She turned back to the dishes. Behind her, she heard him get up from the table, heard his boots on the floor moving toward the door, and then stopping. "Mabel." "Yes?" "The time. In the stew." He paused, working something out in the way he did, slowly, without hurry. It tasted like something I'd forgotten existed. He left before she could answer. She stood at the sink with her hands in the water and didn't move for a moment. She had been in Harwick for 6 weeks when Lenora Vance made her real move. It came through the back door, the way real damage usually does. Not a direct attack, but a whisper campaign that Mabel didn't know was happening until she overheard 2 of the hands talking behind the equipment shed. She hadn't meant to overhear it. She'd been returning an oil lantern to the shed when she caught her own name. Heard Lenora's been telling people in town that Gideon only took her on because he needed a cook. That it's not a real marriage arrangement, it's just a household arrangement dressed up to look proper. What's the difference? Don't know, but she's been saying Gideon could do better if he wanted. That a man of his position shouldn't be— A pause, a lowered voice. Seen around town with a woman like that. What kind of woman? You know what she means. A longer pause. Vernon says she works harder than 2 ranch hands, and her cornbread's better than any he's had in 20 years. Vernon says a lot of things. Mabel set the lantern down inside the shed door and walked back to the house. She sat in the kitchen for a few minutes doing nothing. Then she opened the accounts ledger and went back to the coffee discrepancy, because there was nothing in that ledger that could hurt her feelings, and right now that was what she needed. She found what she'd suspected. The excessive coffee orders had been going to Denny's account, small amounts taken from the household sundries budget and routed through an unclear notation system. Not a significant theft. More like the habit of a young man who didn't think it counted. But it did count, and it added up, and it was her job to know about it. She brought it to Gideon that evening after dinner. She set the ledger on the table, opened to the page, and pointed to the entries without commentary. He looked at it for a long time. His jaw tightened. "How long has this been happening?" "At least since January, from what I can trace. The notations before that are unclear." He closed the ledger. He said, "I'll speak to Denny." "That's your decision," Mabel said. "I'm not telling you what to do with it. I'm telling you what's there." He looked at her. "Why not tell me what to do with it?" "Because it's your ranch and your man," she said. "I can tell you what the numbers mean. What you do next is yours." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Most people who found something like this would come in with a position already formed. "I came with information," Mabel said. "I leave the position forming to the person with the authority to act on it." He studied her with the sideways look she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was recalibrating something. "Where did you learn to think like that?" 12 boarding house men who all wanted different things and all thought their opinion was the one that mattered, she said. "I learned fast that my job was to see clearly and let them think they were in charge." Something crossed his face that she thought might be amusement, though it was brief. "And were they? In charge?" Mabel said, The boarding house ran smoothly for 6 years. He laughed. It was a short sound, not elaborate, but it was real, and it surprised them both. She was still thinking about that sound later, washing the dinner things, when Gideon came back through the kitchen door. Mabel. She turned. He was holding his hat in his hand, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was working out how to say something. Lenora Vance is going to continue making your life difficult, he said. I can't stop her from talking. I know that, Mabel said. I can stop you from having to hear it alone, he said. If you want? He put his hat back on, which meant the thing was said, and he was done with it. Think on it. He went out. Mabel stood in the kitchen with a wet dish in her hand and thought about what alone meant to a man who'd spent 7 winters in a house that had been keeping its distance from him. She thought about a lot of things. She thought about the letter she'd written, the plain, honest letter, and how certain she'd been that it would come to nothing, and how it had led her here instead, to a kitchen that smelled like thyme, and a man who laughed at things when she wasn't expecting it, and a town that hadn't decided what to make of her yet. She hung the dish on the drying rack. She was very tired and not at all sure what came next. But she was here. And Harwick hadn't broken her yet, and she had somewhere in the back of the pantry behind the boot polish enough dried thyme to last the whole winter. That would have to be enough for tonight. The dried thyme lasted until the 3rd week of June. Mabel found the empty jar on a Tuesday morning and added it to the supply list she'd been keeping in the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. The same notebook where she tracked what the pantry had, what it needed, what was being used faster than expected, and what had been quietly wasted for years before she arrived. The notebook was nearly half full. She'd been at Rourke Ranch for 7 weeks. 7 weeks was long enough to know which floorboards creaked at which hour of the night. Long enough to know that Gideon drank his first coffee before he spoke to anyone in the morning, and that this was not rudeness, but necessity, and that once the cup was empty, he became a different, more accessible person. Long enough to know that Vernon, the oldest hand, had a bad knee he would not mention and compensated for it by arriving everywhere slightly earlier than needed so he wouldn't have to be seen limping to catch up. Long enough to know that Denny, after Gideon spoke to him privately about the coffee accounts, had shown up at the kitchen door the following morning and stood there without speaking until Mabel looked up from the stove. I didn't know it was being taken from the household account, he'd said. I thought it came from the equipment budget. It doesn't matter which budget, Mabel said, not turning from the stove. It wasn't yours. Yes, ma'am. A pause. I'm sorry, ma'am. She'd turned then and looked at him, 19 years old, ears still red, standing in her kitchen doorway like a man waiting for sentencing. I know you are, she said. Sit down. Breakfast is in 10 minutes. He'd looked startled. Then he sat down, and from that morning forward, he was the first hand in the kitchen every day, and the last one to leave without asking if she needed anything carried or lifted. People were manageable, Mabel had learned, if you understood them properly. Denny wasn't a thief. He was a boy who hadn't thought carefully, and there was a significant difference, and treating those two things identically was the fastest way to turn the first into the second. She understood people. She'd spent her life having to, because when the world decides what you are before you open your mouth, you learn to read rooms quickly, or you suffer for it. What she was still working out, in the 7th week, was Gideon. He was not a complicated man in the way that difficult men are complicated. He was complicated in the way that closed country is complicated. No obvious landmarks, no road signs, but traversable if you paid attention to the land itself. He said what he meant and meant what he said, but he didn't say much, and what he left unsaid required careful reading. She knew he'd noticed the changes she'd made to the household. The food, the pantry reorganization, the supply corrections, the accounts. She knew he'd seen all of it because he was the kind of man who noticed everything and simply didn't make a production of noticing. What she didn't know, and found herself thinking about more than she meant to, was what he thought about her specifically. Not what she did. About her. She was aware this was dangerous territory for a woman in her position, and she tried to stay out of it. She didn't always succeed. The first real test of her place at Rourke Ranch came not from Gideon and not from Lenora Vance. It came from a man named Carver Hayes. Carver Hayes was the foreman at the Belridge operation, the second largest ranch in the territory, and he rode in one Thursday in late June to discuss a cattle transfer arrangement with Gideon. He was the kind of man who filled a room through deliberate effort rather than natural presence. Loud voice, wide stance, the the practiced confidence of someone who had learned that projection worked on most people most of the time. He came through the main house to find Gideon and found Mabel instead, sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts ledger open and a column of figures she was reconciling spread across 3 pages. Carver Hayes looked at her for a moment. Then he looked around the kitchen as if confirming it was, in fact, just a kitchen, and then he looked back at her. "You the cook?" he said. "I'm Mabel Rourke," she said. She used the name deliberately. She and Gideon were not yet married. There had been no formal discussion of timing, though the arrangement had a marriage at its premise, but she used it because she was in her household and she had earned the right to use it. "Gideon's expecting you. He's down at the south pasture. One of the hands can take you." Carver Hayes leaned against the door frame. "Rourke's wife, huh?" He looked at her again, the full assessment, slower this time, and his expression did the thing that expressions do when a man is deciding how much respect a woman is owed. "Well, they said he'd found someone. I expected—" He smiled, easy and careless. "Something a little different." Mabel looked at him over the ledger. "Mr. Hayes, one of the hands will take you to the south pasture. You can wait on the porch if you'd like." "No offense meant," he said, the way people say it when they know they've given offense and don't care. "None received," Mabel said. She looked back at her figures. He waited, apparently expecting something more, some embarrassment, some flinching. When he didn't get it, he pushed off the doorframe and went looking for a hand to guide him to the pasture. Mabel sat at the table and pressed her hand flat against the ledger page and breathed through it. Then she went back to her figures because the figures were real and the figures didn't have opinions about her size. She told Gideon about the exchange that evening, not to complain, not to ask him to do anything. She told him because she had decided early that she would not manage his household by keeping things from him, and that extended to things that happened in his household that involved his business relationships. Gideon listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "What would you like me to do about it?" "Nothing," Mabel said. "I handled it." "Then why tell me?" "Because you should know what your business associates say in your house," she said, "and because I won't have you surprised by anything later if I can help it." He was quiet for a moment. "He say anything else?" "No, they sent him to the pasture." A pause. "Good." She turned back to the stove. Behind her, Gideon said, "Carver Hayes has been making cattle deals in this territory for 15 years on the strength of his mouth and other men's tolerance." A pause. His last 2 arrangements have had number discrepancies that nobody held him to account for." Mabel stopped stirring. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Transfer counts that came in under what was agreed. Difference absorbed into something called a transit loss notation." She was quiet. "That's the same notation as the coffee." "It is." He let that sit. "I was already looking at it, but I wanted you to know why I'm looking at it, since you're working the accounts." She turned around. "You want me to go through his previous invoices?" "If you're willing." "Yes," she said. "I'll need the last 3 years' transfer records if you have them." "I have them." He said it simply, like a man who never threw anything away, which she was beginning to suspect was exactly what he was. "Then I'll look at them," Mabel said. It was not what she'd expected when she'd agreed to come to Wyoming. She'd expected to cook and manage a household and build something quietly domestic. She hadn't expected to be sitting at a kitchen table with 3 years of cattle transfer invoices, cross-referencing livestock counts against payment records and finding, in the 3rd folder, that Carver Hayes had been systematically underreporting transfer counts for at least 2 of those 3 years and applying the difference, small amounts, never large enough to trigger a formal dispute, to a secondary account that did not appear in the primary ledger. It was not a small amount when you added it across 36 months. She brought it to Gideon on a Saturday morning when the hands were doing fence work and the house was quiet. She spread the pages out on the kitchen table and walked him through it without editorializing, the same way she'd walked him through the coffee discrepancy. Here is what is, here is what it adds up to, here is where the notation doesn't hold. Gideon sat across the table from her and read everything she showed him. He did not rush it. He went through each page carefully, asking 2 questions, which she answered. Then he stacked the papers and put his hands flat on top of them. "That's theft," he said. "Yes," Mabel said. "Not petty theft." "No." He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. If I take this to the county land office, it becomes a legal matter. Carver Hayes has friends in that office. I know, Mabel said, but the numbers don't have friends. Numbers are just numbers. He looked at her. That a philosophy? That's 12 years of keeping accounts, she said. People lie. Ledgers don't. If you go into that office with documentation this clear, they can't make it disappear without making themselves part of it. He considered that. You think I should go? I think it's your decision, she said. I think the documentation will hold. I think waiting gives him time to cover it. But it's your ranch and your call. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Come with me. Mabel blinked. To the land office? You work the numbers. You can explain them better than I can. He stood up. And I'd rather not walk in there alone. She had not expected that. She went. The land office in Harwick was a narrow building with a clerk named Aldous Briggs, who looked like a man who processed paperwork with the enthusiasm of someone counting days until a retirement that was still 15 years away. He looked at Gideon with the attention reserved for a man of 12,000 acres, and he looked at Mabel with the attention reserved for a woman he had not expected to see in this particular office. Mabel set the documentation on his desk and began to explain it. 20 minutes later, Aldous Briggs was writing things down in a separate notebook with a careful pen. Walking back to the wagon afterward, Gideon said, You lost him twice when you got into the subledger notation. I know, Mabel said. I went back both times. You did. He paused. Where did you learn to present numbers to people who don't want to understand them? Same boarding house, she said. 12 men, none of whom wanted to hear at the heating budget was overspent. You learn to present the numbers in a way that makes the conclusion feel like something they thought of themselves. He gave her the sideways look. Did it work tonight? Briggs will file the documentation by Wednesday, Mabel said. He'll feel like it was his idea. They drove home in the kind of quiet that had started to feel, to Mabel, like its own form of conversation. The shift in the ranch hands came gradually, the way most real changes come. Not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. It started with the food, which it often does, because people will maintain almost any social position right up until someone feeds them something that makes their pretenses feel less important than their hunger. By the fourth week, Denny was setting the table without being asked. By the fifth, the other hands were rotating who did the washing up after dinner, which had never happened before Mabel arrived. By the sixth week, Vernon had begun leaving his boot by the kitchen door when it needed resoling. An act of trust that he would not have explained if you asked him to, but that meant he had accepted her as a permanent fixture of the household. None of them discussed any of this. Men rarely do. What they discussed, when they thought she couldn't hear, was the food. She heard them because the walls of a working ranch house are not particularly thick, and she was up early, and they were up early, and the kitchen window was open on warm mornings. She heard Denny tell the hand called Pruitt that the apple preserves she'd made from the forgotten dried apples in the back storage were better than anything his mother had put up in Missouri. She heard Vernon say, to no one in particular one evening outside the equipment shed, that it was strange how a house could be full of men for 7 years and still feel empty, and strange how it took a woman from Nebraska to make it feel inhabited again. She stood at the kitchen window and pretended she hadn't heard that, but she carried it around for the rest of the day. Gideon had a habit she'd identified by the 6th week. He came home earlier than he needed to. He was a man who could have stayed out at the cattle operation until dark, and had legitimate reasons for it, and in the years before she arrived, he apparently often had. Now he was in the yard by 5 most evenings, which meant he was at the table by 5:30, which meant dinner was a meal shared rather than consumed in shifts at odd hours. She noticed. She did not mention it. One evening in late July, after a day that had involved a broken wagon wheel, a dispute between Pruitt and Denny over a tool that came close to a physical confrontation before Vernon intervened, and a thunderstorm that ruined the clothesline, Gideon came in at 5:30 and sat down at the kitchen table with the look of a man who had already spent everything the day had asked of him. Mabel put a bowl of slow-cooked beef stew in front of him without comment. He ate several spoonfuls without speaking. Then he said, not looking up, "How does food make a man feel like he's come home?" It was such a particular question, asked so quietly, that Mabel stopped what she was doing at the counter and thought about it genuinely before answering. "I don't think it's the food exactly," she said. I think it's having someone who knew you were coming and thought about what you'd need. She paused. My mother used to say, and she wasn't a sentimental woman, that cooking for someone is the most practical form of caring there is. It's not pretty, it's hot, and it smells, and it takes hours. But it's real. Gideon looked up at her. She realized she'd said more than she meant to, and turned back to the counter. Your mother sounds like a smart woman, he said. She was, Mabel said. She died 2 years before I came here. I'm sorry. She'd have liked Wyoming, Mabel said. She liked things that didn't apologize for being hard. He was quiet. Then, is that where you got it? Got what? The way you have of not apologizing for anything. Mabel turned around. He was watching her with an expression that was more open than usual, the way faces go sometimes when a person is tired enough that maintaining a closed expression requires more effort than they have left. I apologize when I'm wrong, she said. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. She held his gaze. I got it from being large in a world that wanted me to be ashamed of it. At some point, the apology became more exhausting than just existing. He looked at her for a long moment. For what it's worth, he said, I have never once thought you should apologize for anything. Mabel felt something shift behind her sternum. Not dramatically. Not in a way she would have described to another person. Just a quiet internal rearrangement of something that had been placed incorrectly for a long time. I know, she said. That's why I'm still here. The Vance dinner invitation arrived in August on a cream-colored card with Lenora's handwriting in careful loops across the front. Mabel held it in the kitchen and read it twice. A dinner party. Friday evening. The Vance residence. Gideon Rourke and the word was companion, which was not the word for what Mabel was, and they both knew it. She brought it to Gideon. He read it once and set it on the table. We don't have to go. We should go, Mabel said. He looked at her. Why? Because refusing gives her the narrative, Mabel said. If we go, I get to write part of it. He considered this. You're sure? I'm not sure about anything, she said, but I'd rather be uncomfortable on my own terms than comfortable on hers. The Friday evening came and Mabel wore the dark blue wool, the only dress she had that was suitable, and she pinned her hair and looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand in her room and said aloud, to no one, You are smarter than every one of those people, and smart lasts longer than pretty. Her mother's voice still clear after 2 years. Then she went downstairs. Gideon was waiting in the front room in his good coat, hat in hand. He looked at her when she came down. He said nothing for a moment, which made her shoulders begin to tighten. Then he said, That's a good color on you. It was 4 words. It was not a speech. But Mabel had spent 33 years waiting for some version of those 4 words from someone who said them because they meant them and not because they wanted something, and the specific weight of those 4 words hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Thank you, she said, and her voice was steady. The Vance house was the grandest in Harwick, which it intended to be. Lenora received them at the door with the social warmth of a woman who had invited you in order to look at you, which was not actually warmth at all, but its performance. There were 6 other couples at the dinner. Mabel recognized 3 of the women from the dry goods store. She could feel the room taking her in, calculating her, deciding how it felt about Gideon Rourke showing up with this particular woman. She sat where she was placed, and she ate what was served, and she listened carefully before she spoke, which was what she always did in rooms that were evaluating her. Lenora's cook had made a roast that was slightly overdone and a gravy that had separated and had been reconstituted imperfectly, and Mabel said nothing about this because she was a guest and not a competitor. What she did talk about, when a man named Whitfield asked what she'd done before coming to Wyoming, was the boarding house accounts. Not the cooking, the accounts. Specifically, the system she'd devised for managing a 12-person household budget across variable seasonal income, and the method she'd used for tracking supply costs against market fluctuation, and what she'd found when she looked at the records in Gideon's operation and what those records had revealed. Whitfield was a cattle broker. He leaned forward partway through. By the end of the table conversation, she had Whitfield, a man named Dorset, who ran the Harwick Bank, and another man whose name she missed, all asking questions. Lenora watched from the other end of the table with an expression Mabel recognized as reappraisal. Not friendship, not warmth. Just the recalculation that happens when someone turns out to be more than the category you put them in. On the way home in the wagon, Gideon said, "Dorset never talks that much at dinner." "He had questions," Mabel said. "He did." A pause. "So did Whitfield." "Whitfield's being underpaid on 3 of his secondary contracts," Mabel said. "He doesn't know it yet. I didn't tell him outright, but I asked the right questions." Gideon looked at her sideways in the dark. "You got all that from dinner conversation." "I got all that from listening carefully," she said. "Most people tell you everything you need to know if you let them talk long enough." He was quiet for a while. The road back to the ranch was dark, and the stars were out the way they get in Wyoming. Extravagant, almost aggressive. She'd never seen stars like this in Nebraska. "Mabel," he said. "Yes." "The arrangement we have." He was working it out slowly, the way he always worked things out, turning the words over before committing to them. "I want it to be a real arrangement, not just what it was agreed to be at the start." She was quiet. "I should have said that before now," he said. "I know that." "Why didn't you?" she said. He thought about it. "Because I wasn't sure what you'd say. And I'm a man who doesn't ask questions he's not ready to hear answered." The wagon moved under the stars. Mabel looked at the road ahead. "You could ask now," she said. He said, "Are you willing to stay?" She turned and looked at him in the dark. The man who had carried her trunk without being asked, who had said, "Take whatever you need," without hesitation, who laughed at unexpected moments and noticed everything and said she had a good color in her dress with the specificity of someone who had been paying attention for weeks. "I was willing to stay from the 3rd day," she said. He let out a breath. "I should have asked from the 3rd day." "You weren't ready to hear the answer yet," she said. He almost smiled. "No, I wasn't." They came through the ranch gate and she could see the lights she'd left burning in the kitchen window, amber squares in the dark. She had not expected to make anything like home when she climbed onto a train in Nebraska. But that light in the window was hers. The time on the shelf was hers. The ledger on the table was hers, and the pantry that no longer smelled of old boot polish was hers, and the hands who left their boots by her kitchen door were hers, in the way that people become yours when you feed them properly and treat them like they're worth the trouble. She was not a woman anyone had expected Gideon Rourke to bring home. She was becoming, quietly and without anyone's permission, the woman who ran his household, documented his accounts, attended his dinners, and made the lights come on in a house that had been dark for 7 years. Lenora Vance was not finished with her. Mabel knew that. The reappraisal at the dinner table was not acceptance. It was a tactical pause. And the Carver-Hayes matter was not resolved, only filed, and Aldous Briggs did not have Hayes's connections, and Hayes would eventually hear what had been filed. And the harvest gathering was 8 weeks away, and Mabel had already overheard enough market talk at the Vance dinner to know that this year's harvest season was going to be harder than usual, and that the gathering was carrying more weight than it normally did, and that there were people in Harwick who needed it to go right. She didn't know yet what any of that would mean for her. She got down from the wagon and walked toward the kitchen light. She had dried thyme on the shelf and 3 more jars of apple preserves and a clean ledger page waiting for tomorrow's figures. That would do for tonight. The Carver-Hayes matter came to a head on a Wednesday, which was the same day the first hailstorm hit the Tillman farm 6 miles east of Harwick and destroyed 3 acres of late-season vegetables that had been promised to the Harvest Gathering Committee. Mabel didn't know about the hailstorm yet. She was standing in the yard watching Carver-Hayes ride in through the ranch gate with 2 men she didn't recognize flanking him like punctuation. And she was calculating the distance between herself and the kitchen door, not because she was afraid of him, but because she wanted the ledger in her hands before this conversation started. She didn't make it. Hayes pulled his horse up 10 feet from where she was standing and looked down at her from the saddle with the expression of a man who had spent the last 2 weeks being angry and had decided to spend today doing something about it. "Where's Rourke?" he said. Not a question. "He's at the south pasture," Mabel said. "Same as most mornings." "You filed documentation against me with the land office." He said it flat, no inflection, the way people say things when they've rehearsed them. "Gideon filed documentation," Mabel said. "I prepared the figures." "Same thing." "It's not, actually." Hayes swung down from the saddle. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, and he used the size the way men sometimes do, not as threat exactly, but as a reminder of what threat could look like if he decided to go that direction. He walked toward her and stopped closer than was comfortable. "Those numbers are wrong," he said. "They're not," Mabel said. "Transfer counts fluctuate. That's a known factor in this business. Briggs has no business treating normal transit variance as the variance you're describing would be roughly 3 to 4% across a single season," Mabel said. "What I documented was 11% across 3 years in a consistent directional pattern. Consistent directional variance isn't variance, it's a method." She held his gaze. "You know the difference." Hayes's jaw tightened. "I want those documents withdrawn," he said. "That's not my decision," Mabel said. "That's Gideon's." "Then get Gideon." "He's at the south pasture," Mabel said, same voice, same pace. "You're welcome to ride out." He looked at her for a long moment. The 2 men behind him hadn't moved. The yard was very quiet in the way that yards get quiet when something is about to happen or decide not to. "You know what you are?" Hayes said. It was not meant as a genuine question. "I know exactly what I am," Mabel said. "The question is whether you know what those ledger pages are, and whether you'd like to discuss them somewhere more private before Aldous Briggs finishes his filing." Hayes stared. "Briggs files on Fridays," Mabel said. "Today is Wednesday. That's 2 days, Mr. Hayes, if you'd like to have a conversation with Gideon that might alter the shape of what gets filed. Or you can stand in this yard and tell me what I am, and nothing will change except that you've wasted a Wednesday." Something moved behind Hayes's eyes. Not respect. Not quite. But the recalculation that happens when a person realizes they misjudged the room. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode out with his 2 men behind him. Mabel stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat on the wood and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She was glad Hayes hadn't seen that. She was still sitting there when Vernon appeared in the kitchen doorway, hat in hand, moving carefully on his bad knee. He looked at her and looked at the table and said, "I was by the barn. Heard some of that." "I know," Mabel said. "You handled it well." "I handled it the way I could," she said. "Whether it was well depends on what Gideon decides to do." Vernon nodded slowly. He put his hat back on. "He'll do the right thing," he said. "He always does, eventually. Just takes him a minute to get around to it." He went back out. Mabel got up, put the kettle on, and started thinking about dinner. Gideon came in at 5:30, saw her face, and said, "Hayes came." "He did." She told him everything. She did not editorialize or advise. She gave him what happened the way she gave him account figures. Here is what is, here is what was said, here is where the decision sits. Gideon listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set. When she finished, he said, "He threatened you." "He implied," Mabel said. "He didn't threaten outright." "Implied is enough." He uncrossed his arms. "I'll ride to Briggs in the morning and tell him to proceed." "You might lose the transfer business," Mabel said. "Hayes handles contracts for 4 other ranches in the territory." "I know that." "I wanted to make sure you knew." "I know," Gideon said. "The answer's still the same." She nodded. She turned back to the stove. He said, "Thank you for standing your ground with him." "It's my yard too," Mabel said. He was quiet. Then, "Yes, it is." She heard him move to the table and sit down, and she heard the particular sound of a man settling into a chair, the way people settle when they've made a decision and the weight of undecided things has lifted. She made the dinner and didn't say anything else about Hayes, and neither did he. The second hailstorm hit a week later. The first one, the one that took the Tillman vegetables, had been bad but manageable. The Tillman family was one farm, one contribution to the harvest gathering table. Difficult, but not catastrophic. The second storm hit on a Friday night, and it hit broader. By Saturday morning, Mabel heard in town she'd gone for supplies, which she did on Saturdays now, with a list and a wagon and a nodding familiarity with the dry goods proprietor that had replaced the early week's wariness on both sides. That 3 more farms east of Harwick had taken significant damage. The Crawley operation had lost their entire late-season kitchen garden. The Morse family, who'd been counting on the gathering sales to cover a promissory note due in October, had lost their squash and their potato crop both. The woman who ran the gathering's food committee was a widow named Agnes Purdy, who had organized the event's communal supper for 11 years running and whose competence in that arena was not disputed by anyone, including Lenora Vance, which was the highest possible endorsement. Mabel had met her twice, a thin, practical woman with an efficient manner and gray hair she wore braided close to her head. On the Monday following the second storm, Agnes Purdy came to find Mabel. She arrived at the ranch in a wagon driven by her son, a young man of about 25 who sat with the reins while his mother came to the kitchen door and knocked. Mabel opened it. Agnes looked at her with the directness of someone who had a finite amount of time and a specific purpose. "Mrs. Rourke," she said, "I'm in trouble, and I've heard you know your way around a kitchen." Mabel stepped back from the door. "Come in." Agnes sat at the kitchen table and told her the situation without decoration. The communal supper was the centerpiece of the harvest gathering, 8 days out. It fed between 300 and 400 people across the afternoon and evening of the main gathering day. Visitors came from as far as 60 miles. Merchants depended on the foot traffic. The cattle dealers closed their biggest transactions of the year over the supper tables. It was not merely a meal, it was the commercial engine of the entire event. The produce losses from 2 hailstorms had gutted Agnes's planned menu. She'd been counting on fresh vegetables from 6 farms. She had 4 of them now, significantly short of what they'd promised. The woman she'd engaged to head the cooking operation, a woman named Clara Bunch, who ran a small hotel kitchen in Harwick, had quit that morning, claiming the situation was unmanageable, and she wouldn't have her name attached to a failure. "Clara's not wrong that it's difficult," Agnes said. "She's wrong that it can't be done. But I need someone who knows how to work with less and make it not look like less." She looked at Mabel directly. "I've been told you can do that." "Who told you?" Mabel said. "Vernon," Agnes said, "and Dorset's wife after the Vance dinner, and Whitfield, who apparently tracked me down specifically to tell me." A pause. "And Gideon, when I spoke to him 2 days ago." Mabel was still. "Gideon knew you were coming?" "He told me you'd make up your own mind," Agnes said. "He said he wouldn't push it either direction, but he said if you were willing, he'd put Rourke Ranch's smokehouse and food stores at your disposal." She folded her hands on the table. "That's a significant offer." "I know what it is," Mabel said. She looked at the table for a moment. 8 days, 300 to 400 people. A stripped menu and no head cook, and a town that had watched her arrive off a train and made its conclusions. "What's your remaining confirmed supply?" she said. Agnes had a list. She produced it from her coat pocket, handwritten, 2 pages. Mabel read it twice. It was not nothing. It was less than it should have been, and it required a different approach than Agnes had planned, but it was not nothing. She had beef. Agnes had 2 ranchers who'd confirmed donation of a combined 800 pounds of beef, which was good. She had dried beans, adequate stores of cornmeal and flour, and a reasonable supply of salt pork. What she didn't have was the fresh vegetable variety that made a frontier supper look like abundance rather than subsistence. Mabel thought about the apple preserves. She thought about the dried fruit she'd found in the back storage room at the ranch. Not all of it used yet, more than she'd needed for the household. She thought about what her mother had taught her about making a table look generous when the cupboard was short. She thought about 300 to 400 people, and merchants who needed the gathering to succeed, and families like the Morses who were already down their potato crop and couldn't afford a failed trading season on top of it. "I need complete control of the food," she said. "Not consultation, control. The menu, the cooking order, the staff, the timing." "Yes," Agnes said. "I need access to Rourke's smokehouse and food stores, confirmed in writing before I agree. I'll get that from Gideon this afternoon. And I need 48 hours to plan before I commit to a final menu, because I want to know what I'm committing to before I say yes." Agnes looked at her steadily. "If you take 48 hours, that leaves 6 days." "I know," Mabel said. "That's enough." Agnes put the list back in her coat pocket and stood up. "I'll come back Wednesday morning." "I'll have an answer Wednesday morning," Mabel said. After Agnes left, Mabel sat alone at the kitchen table with the 2-page supply list in front of her and the accounts ledger open to a blank page and a pencil in her hand. She started writing. Gideon came in at 5:30 and found her still at the table, the blank ledger page now covered in figures and notations and crossed-out quantities. He looked at the page and looked at her. "Agnes came," he said. "You knew she would." "I knew she was going to try." He sat down across from her. "I meant what I told her. I won't push you." "I know you won't," Mabel said. She looked at him. Why didn't you tell me she was coming? He was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't want you to do it for the wrong reason. What's the wrong reason? Because you felt like you owed the town something, he said. Or because you felt like you had to prove something to people who don't deserve the proof. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. If you do it, I want it to be because you want to. Mabel looked at him across the table. And what do you want? I want whatever you decide, he said. Honestly? She believed him. That was the thing about Gideon Rourke. He was not a man who said what he didn't mean. She had learned to trust the specific gravity of his words because he spent them so carefully. I want to do it, she said. Not for the town, for Agnes Purdy, who has run this thing for 11 years and doesn't deserve to see it fail. And for the Morse family, who lost their potatoes. She paused. And because I know I can, and knowing that and not doing it would bother me. He nodded once. You said I could have the smokehouse and stores. Everything I have, he said. You pick what you need. She looked back at her notes. I'm going to need more dried apples, and I'll want to send word to the Crawley farm. I heard they lost their garden, but I don't know about their root cellar. I can ride out tomorrow and ask. And I need you to find me 4 people who can follow direction and not panic, she said. I'll have Denny and Vernon. I need 4 more. I'll find them, Gideon said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the particular attention he gave things he found genuinely interesting, not the polite attention of a man performing engagement, but the real thing, steady and specific. You're not worried, she said. No, he said. You should at least be a little worried. Probably, he admitted. But I've watched you work for 4 months, Mabel. I've seen what you do when things are short and the situation is complicated and other people's confidence is running low. He said it plainly, no performance in it. I'm not worried. She went back to her notes so he wouldn't see what his face did to her equilibrium when he looked at her like that. Word got around Harwick, the way words always got around Harwick, through the dry goods store and the hotel lobby and the 2 saloons and the post office. In that order, each stop adding a layer of interpretation. By Tuesday, the version circulating was that Mabel Rourke had agreed to take over the harvest gathering supper, which was not quite accurate yet since she hadn't given Agnes her formal answer, but was accurate in spirit. Lenora Vance heard by Tuesday afternoon. Mabel heard about Lenora's reaction through Denny, who had heard it from a hand at the Vance property, who had heard it directly. She said, Denny began, and then stopped, clearly editing. Just say it, Mabel said. She was rolling biscuit dough. She said Gideon's big kitchen woman was going to ruin the most important day of Harwick's year and make a fool of herself and him both in front of the whole territory. He paused. And she was going to make sure people remembered that she said so beforehand. Mabel pressed the biscuit cutter into the dough. Thank you, Denny, she said. Yes, ma'am. He hesitated. For what it's worth, Vernon says, I know what Vernon says, Mabel said. Go check on the smokehouse temperature. He went. She cut 12 biscuits in a row and put them in the pan and tried to think about Lenora's words with some detachment, the way she'd learned to think about things that made her chest tighten. Hold them out at arm's length and look at them as information, rather than wounds. Lenora wasn't entirely wrong about the risk. If this failed, it failed publicly, in front of the whole territory. It would follow Gideon. It would confirm everything anyone had ever quietly thought about the large woman from Nebraska who should never have been brought here in the first place. She put the biscuit pan in the oven. And then she thought about the Morse family's promissory note, and Agnes Purdy's 11 years, and the supply list she'd spent 2 days working around. And she thought, very deliberately, I know what I'm doing. I have always known what I'm doing. The only difference between this and the boarding house is the number of mouths, and the fact that people are watching. She had been watched her entire life. She could manage being watched. Wednesday morning, Agnes came back. Mabel gave her a yes and a 14-page menu plan with quantities, cooking sequence, and a staffing requirement list. Agnes read the first 3 pages standing in the kitchen doorway. This is... she started. It's unconventional, Mabel said. The menu's unconventional. I'm not trying to replace what you lost. I'm building something different from what's available. The hand pies, Agnes said. I have the apple stores and I have the time. 300 hand pies is achievable in 6 days with 6 people. Agnes looked up from the pages. Where did you learn to think like this? From cooking for people who didn't have enough and needed to believe they did, Mabel said. My mother's kitchen in Nebraska, the boarding house. You learn to make less feel like more, or you let people go hungry. Agnes folded the pages carefully and put them in her coat pocket. I'll get you everything on the staffing list by Thursday. Friday at the latest, Mabel said. I need Saturday to show them the system. Friday, Agnes confirmed. She left. Mabel stood in the kitchen and looked at the blank page where she'd started her notes 4 days ago, now covered in planning and crossed out quantities and margin figures. She thought about what Gideon had said. Not for the town. No, not for the town. The 6 days that followed were the most exhausting of her life, and she had spent a significant portion of her life being exhausted. She was in the smokehouse by 4 every morning. By 5 she had Denny and a woman named Ruth Gaines. A farmer's wife Agnes had sent, quiet and capable, and exactly the kind of person who listened to instruction once and didn't require repeating, working on the dried bean preparation. The beef needed 3 days of slow smoking, and she couldn't start it until she had the volume confirmed, which came through Thursday morning, and when the numbers came in slightly under what she'd planned for, she spent 40 minutes reworking the quantities before telling Gideon quietly that she needed 20 more pounds from the ranch stores. Done, he said. No hesitation. The apple hand pies became the project that nearly broke her, not because the recipe was difficult, but because 300 pies required 300 portions of pastry and 300 portions of filling and a sequence of baking that had to be managed precisely, or the early batches would be stale before the hour. She worked the sequence out on paper twice, found a flaw the second time through, worked it a third time, and showed it to Ruth Gaines. Ruth looked at the paper for a long moment. If we start the first batch Friday evening, she said, they'll keep overnight if we store them right. What's the storage condition? Mabel said. My root cellar, Ruth said. It's the right temperature. I've stored pastry there before. Mabel looked at her. You're sure? I've kept pastry for 3 days in that cellar without it going off, Ruth said simply. I wouldn't suggest it if I wasn't. Then we start Friday evening, Mabel said. Ruth nodded and went back to the beans. The morning of the harvest gathering came in clear and cool, which Wyoming in September sometimes offered as a gift before it took something else back. Mabel had been awake since 3. She had her 6 people in position by 5:30, the cooking sequence mapped on 2 large sheets of paper tacked to the side of the temporary cooking shed that the gathering committee had erected at the fairground, and 300 apple hand pies in Ruth Gaines's root cellar, waiting for transport. The cooking shed was not what she'd hoped. Agnes had apologized for it on arrival. The committee had done what they could, but the structure was patched together from borrowed lumber, and it showed. The stoves inside were adequate, but the ventilation was poor and the work surfaces were too few. Mabel walked through it at 6 in the morning, assessed it with Vernon at her shoulder, and made 11 adjustments to her sequence before breakfast. By 8, visitors were arriving on the fairground. Cattle dealers set up in the north field. Merchants opened their stands along the main walk. The smell of the territory in early fall, dry grass and wood smoke and horses and leather, came in over everything. By 10, something started going wrong with the wind. It had been calm at dawn. By 10, it was picking up from the northwest, which in Wyoming meant something was building behind it. She could feel it in the temperature drop, and in the way the cooking shed's patched walls began to breathe and settle. By 11, the wind was strong enough to knock a stack of tin plates off the work table. Mabel picked them up and kept working. At 11:30, the sound the shed made changed. She heard it before she understood it. A low groan from the northwest corner, the sound of lumber doing something it wasn't built to do. She had time to step back, time to say, "Ruth, move left," before the northwest post gave way and the roof of the cooking shed buckled and came down on that corner with a crack that silenced the whole fairground for 3 full seconds. Not a collapse, a partial failure. 1/4 of the structure folding inward, taking 2 stoves with it, spilling the contents of 3 pots across the floor, bending the stovepipe into something non-functional. The other 3/4 were still standing. Mabel stood in the functional half of the shed and looked at what had spilled and what hadn't. The beef was in the smokehouse. The hand pies were in Ruth's cellar. The beans were in a covered pot on the still standing stove. She had lost the soup. She had lost 1 pot of stewed vegetables. She had lost the use of 2 stoves. Around her, her 6 people stood very still, the way people stand when they're waiting for the person in charge to tell them which way to go. From outside the shed, she could hear the fairground going quiet, the way crowds go quiet when something has happened, and they're waiting to find out if it's a disaster. Mabel looked at Vernon. Vernon looked at her. "We go outside," she said. The wind is a problem inside and outside both," she said. "Outside, I can use the ranch braziers and the wagon beds as work surfaces, and the open space means the stoves don't back up with smoke." She turned. "Denny." "Ma'am." "Get the wagon and go to Ruth's cellar. Bring every single pie. Stack them careful." She turned to the others. "Ruth, cover the beans and carry the pot outside. I need that stove out of the corner. Can we lift it?" "With 3 people," Vernon said. "Get 3 people." She walked out of the shed into the Wyoming wind and stood on the fairground looking at the open space in front of her and thought about her mother's kitchen in a bad winter when the stovepipe cracked and they'd cooked on the hearth for 3 weeks and still fed people. Gideon was there. She hadn't seen him arrive. He was simply there, standing 6 feet away with his hat in his hand, watching her. "Tell me what you need," he said. She looked at the space. She thought about braziers and wagon beds and cast iron and open air. "I need every brazier from the ranch," she said, "and 4 wagon boards for tables and your 2 largest cast iron pots. And I need you to help Vernon move a stove through a broken wall." He put his hat on. "Done," he said, and turned for the ranch. She turned back to the fairground and started building a kitchen out of nothing, and above her the Wyoming sky pressed down with its wind and its cold and its complete indifference, and Mabel Rourke pressed back. She had learned a long time ago that the only weather you could count on was the kind that didn't accommodate your plans, and the only useful response to that was to keep moving. So she moved. The smell of smoke and beef reached the fairground before the first serving was ready, and people began to drift toward the south end of the open ground where Mabel's outdoor kitchen had assembled itself from ranch equipment and improvised table surfaces, and the collective effort of 6 exhausted people who had stopped questioning and started executing. By the time the first pots were ready, there were people waiting. She did not look up at the crowd. She looked at her sequence notes pinned to the side of a wagon with a tent peg and called out what came next. This was the part where you didn't think about the crowd. You thought about the food. The first bowl went to an old man who had been standing at the edge of the crowd for 20 minutes with his hat in his hands, not pushing forward, not calling out, just waiting with the particular patience of someone who had learned not to expect much. Mabel handed it to him herself. He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. He said, "Thank you, ma'am," and moved to a bench and sat down and ate, and Mabel watched him for exactly 3 seconds before turning back to the serving line because there were 400 people and she did not have 3 seconds. The sequence she'd planned held for the first hour. Ruth managed the bean pots with the steady competence she'd shown all week. Denny ran the pie transport from the wagon to the serving table in rotations, carrying them stacked in cloth-lined crates the way she'd shown him. Quickly, level, no jostling. Vernon supervised the braziers with his bad knee and didn't mention it once, moving between them with a measured pace that covered more ground than it appeared to. The 2 people Agnes had sent, a young woman named Cora and a heavy-set farmer named Ike Feller, who had the arms for moving cast iron and the temperament for being told what to do without needing it, explained twice, worked the beef station and kept the portions consistent the way she'd drilled them. It was not running smoothly. She would not have called it smooth. The wind kept catching the fire and she kept adjusting. One of the braziers ran low on fuel and she had to pull Ike from the beef station for 4 minutes to address it, which backed up the serving line and caused a cluster near the front table that Denny had to redirect. The bean pot at the far end burned slightly on the bottom because the brazier beneath it ran hotter than the others, and she hadn't caught it in time, and she added water and stirred and prayed to nothing in particular that the taste hadn't transferred through. It hadn't, or not enough to matter. What she noticed in the spaces between problems was that the crowd was eating, not politely eating, not taking their portion and walking away with the expression of people making do. They were eating in the way that means something, hunched over the bowls, talking less than usual, reaching for the bread without looking up from the beef. By the second hour, the serving line had stopped shrinking. It was growing. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of the crowd shifting, that particular murmur that happens when word moves through a group of people and changes their direction. She looked up from the brazier she was managing and saw that the line extended further back than it had at the start of serving, which meant people were coming back for thirds, or bringing people who hadn't been there earlier, pulling their neighbors in from the merchant stands and the cattle fields with the specific urgency of someone who has found something worth sharing. She looked back at her sequence notes. She had planned for this. She had planned for the possibility that portions would run out and built in the bean and bread fallback for the final hour. She had planned the hand pies as the closing act, held back deliberately, not served until the main dishes were established, so that people encountered them as a last course rather than an alternative, which meant they hit with the full weight of dessert after a real meal, rather than the consolation of something sweet after a disappointment. What she had not planned for was the moment the crowd went quiet. Not entirely quiet. The fairground still had its noise, children, horses, the distant sounds of the cattle dealing in the north field. But the particular noise of the serving area shifted at some point in the second hour into something that was closer to concentration, the way crowds go when they're no longer performing their enjoyment for each other but actually experiencing it. She noticed it, and she kept working. At the 2-hour mark, Vernon appeared at her shoulder. "We're going to run short on beans," he said quietly. Not an accusation, just information. Mabel did the calculation. She had accounted for this. "Pull the backup pot from the wagon," she said. "It's been sitting covered. It'll need 15 minutes on a brazier before it's ready." "Already started," he said. She looked at him. "How did you know I had a backup pot?" Vernon almost smiled. "You've had a backup for everything all week," he said. "I figured there'd be one for the beans." She turned back to the serving table. "Tell Cora to stretch the portion slightly for the next 20 minutes. Just slightly. I don't want people to see it happen." "Done," he said, and went. The apple hand pies came out at the 3rd hour. She had thought about this moment through the entire 6 days of preparation, the moment the pies went out, because the pies were the thing she knew would either confirm or destroy the afternoon. Everything else on the table was adequate by any reasonable measure, better than adequate given the circumstances, but adequate was a word people used when they were being polite. The pies were the thing she'd built the whole menu toward, the closing argument of the meal. And she had 300 of them, and they had been stored exactly right, and they came out of the cloth-lined crates smelling like October and warm sugar and the particular brown butter note that came from the lard crust her mother had taught her. She set the first tray on the table and stepped back. The response was not immediately dramatic. It started with the old man who'd had the first bowl. He was still on his bench, he'd been there for 3 hours, and nobody had told him to leave. And he had the look of a man who had decided this was where he was going to be for the day. He took a hand pie from the first tray and bit into it, and he went very still in the way that people go still when something hits them in a place they'd forgotten was there. Then he said, to no one in particular, "Lord, that's good." And the woman next to him reached for one, and the man next to her reached for one, and from there it went the way good things go, quickly, without formal announcement, driven entirely by proximity and the human instinct to reach for what the person next to you clearly wants. By the time the 4th tray was out, there was a line specifically for the pies. Mabel watched it and felt something she rarely let herself feel, a pure, uncomplicated satisfaction, the kind that had no hedges around it. She had built this. From a stripped supply list in 6 days and a broken shed and a Wyoming wind that didn't accommodate anyone's plans. She had built this and it was working, and 400 people were eating her food in an outdoor kitchen that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. She let herself feel it for about 45 seconds. Then she went back to managing the braziers because the feeling didn't bake pies or hold temperatures. The businessmen arrived at the table an hour before serving ended. She saw them coming from the corner of her eye. A cluster of 3, well-dressed in the way that men who do territory-level commerce dress for public events, with the deliberate stride of people who have something to say and have decided to say it. She recognized Whitfield and Dorset, the 3rd man she didn't know. They were heading for Gideon, who had been working the supply side of the operation all afternoon, hauling wood and managing equipment with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything on the ranch. He was at the far end of the outdoor kitchen area, rolling a spent barrel away from the brazier station, when the 3 men reached him. She watched the exchange from 20 feet away, managing a pot and not appearing to watch. She saw Whitfield reach out and shake Gideon's hand. She saw the gestures, expansive, congratulatory, the body language of men making compliments. She saw Gideon listen, and she saw the moment when his expression shifted, when something changed in the set of his shoulders. He turned and looked directly across the fairground to where she stood. She looked back at him. He said something to the 3 men and pointed. Not toward the food, not toward the outdoor kitchen generally, toward her specifically. She saw the 3 men turn to follow his gesture. She saw their expressions register her. The large woman in the flower-covered apron standing at a brazier in an outdoor kitchen she had built from ranch equipment and borrowed boards, her hair coming out of its pins from the wind and her face reddened from the fire and her hands none of the things anyone in Harwick would have called delicate. She held the gaze of all three of them and did not look away. One of them, Dorset, nodded at her, slowly, with the specific weight of a man adjusting his assessment of something. She turned back to the pot. 40 minutes later, Gideon reached her station. She was working the last of the hand pies out to the table, the final 2 trays, the end of 300. There were people still in line, and she could see they were not all going to get one, and she had already done the math on this and accepted it. You could not always make 300 into 400, and what you could do was make 300 count. Gideon stopped beside her. Not in her way, just beside her. He said, "Whitfield wants to know who cooked the beef." "Tell him it's slow-smoked mesquite over 48 hours, she said. "The key is the basting sequence in the last 8 hours. "I told him it was you," Gideon said. "He wants to speak with you after serving." "I'll be done in about 30 minutes. "I know." He didn't move. "Dorset says it's the best harvest gathering supper he's had in 12 years. He's been coming for 12 years. Mabel said, "Dorset is probably exaggerating." "Dorset doesn't exaggerate. I've known him for 10 years and I've never heard him exaggerate anything." She put the last tray on the table and watched the line move toward it. "The third man," she said. "I don't know him." "Gerald Marsh," Gideon said. "He runs the Territorial Agricultural Commission. He came down from the capital for the gathering." She was quiet. "He asked me how I'd managed to put together an operation this size in 48 hours with half the supply and no permanent structure," Gideon said. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't manage it." He paused. "I said my wife managed it." The word landed on her quietly, the way significant things sometimes land, not with impact, but with weight. She kept her eyes on the serving table. "We're not married yet," she said. "No," he said. "But we will be." It was not a question. It wasn't quite a declaration either. It was Gideon saying a true thing the way he always said true things, plainly, without performance, with the certainty of a man stating a fact that has been settled in his own mind for some time, and he is only now choosing to say aloud. Mabel said, "You might have asked." "I'm asking now," he said. "Are you willing?" She looked at the last hand pies disappearing off the tray. She looked at the fairground filling with the late afternoon light, the merchants at their stands, the families at the tables, the cattle dealers closing their deals in the north field. She looked at Vernon on his bad knee still working the braziers, and Denny moving through the crowd with a refilled coffee pot, and Ruth Gaines wiping down the work surfaces with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who believed in leaving things right. "Yes," she said. "I've been willing." He was quiet for a moment. "Since when?" She turned and looked at him directly. The wind-reddened face, the man who carried trunks without being asked, who said take whatever you need without hesitation, who laughed in unexpected moments and let her be exactly what she was without requiring her to be less. "Since about the 3rd day," she said. The corner of his mouth did the thing that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm a slow reader," he said. "I know," she said. "It's all right." She turned back to the work because the work wasn't finished yet, and behind her she heard him move back to the supply station, and the afternoon went on around them in the ordinary way that afternoons do when the important things have already been said. The serving ended at 4:30, not because the food ran out. The beans held, the bread held, and the last of the coffee went at precisely the moment Mabel had estimated, which gave her a satisfaction that was petty and specific, and she was not ashamed of it. It ended because the light was tipping and people were beginning the journey home, and the gathering crowd thinned naturally the way it always did in the final hour. Agnes Purdy found her at the cleanup station, where Mabel and Cora were washing pots with water heated over the last functional brazier. Agnes looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy all day and had just been relieved of it. 11 years, Agnes said. "That's the best we've ever done." Mabel rinsed a pot. "The beef was good." "The beef was extraordinary," Agnes said. "Gerald Marsh ate 3 portions of the beef." "Then I should have budgeted more beef." Agnes made a sound that was almost a laugh. "The pies, Mabel. People are still talking about the pies." The pies were straightforward. She set the pot down and took up the next one. Good storage made the difference. That was Ruth's call. I'll tell Ruth, Agnes said. I'm also telling you, sir. She paused. I know what this cost you. The week, the planning. Doing it in front of the whole territory with everything working against you. Mabel looked at the pot. It cost what it cost. Are you all right? She considered the question seriously because Agnes asked it seriously and deserved a serious answer. She was exhausted in a way that had gone past physical and into something structural. The fatigue of a person who has held a plan together by will for 6 days and is only now allowing the will to release. Her feet hurt. Her lower back hurt. Her hands were red from fire and washing and the cold that had come in with the late afternoon. I'm all right, she said. Ask me again tomorrow. Agnes nodded. Dorset wants to speak to you before you leave. And Marsh. And there's a woman from the eastern part of the territory, a gathering committee member from Caldwell, who's been asking Agnes Purdy if the Harwick Committee would consider loaning their cook to the Caldwell gathering next spring. Mabel stopped washing. I'm not available to be loaned, she said. I told her that, Agnes said. She may ask you directly. She can ask, Mabel said. The answer will be the same. Agnes touched her arm briefly. Not an embrace, just a touch. The kind that means I see what you did here without requiring it to be made into a speech. Then she went to find Dorset. It was Lenora Vance who came last. Mabel was loading the final equipment into the ranch wagon, working with Denny on the heavier items, when she saw Lenora cross the fairground toward her. The crowd had thinned enough that Lenora's approach was visible from a distance, and Mabel had time to decide how she wanted to stand before Lenora arrived. Whether she wanted any of the defenses up. She decided no. She was too tired for defenses. Lenora stopped 3 feet away. She was still in her good dress from the morning, still composed in the way that Lenora was always composed. But something around her mouth was different. Something that was making her look like a woman who had rehearsed a speech and was now discovering the rehearsal wasn't sufficient. She said, "The supper was exceptional." Mabel said, "Thank you." A pause. "I said things," Lenora said, "before today. That were—" She stopped. She was clearly fighting something. Unkind. Mabel looked at her. "Yes, you did. I want to apologize." Another pause, longer. Lenora Vance looked like a woman for whom the words apologize involved a significant internal rearrangement, and Mabel could see the effort of it, and she did not feel satisfied by that effort the way she might have expected to. She felt instead tired, and faintly sad. And something else she couldn't immediately name, the specific feeling of a thing you braced for that arrives and turns out to be smaller than the bracing. "I accept your apology," Mabel said. Lenora blinked. She had expected, apparently, more than that. "I don't need anything else from you," Mabel said. "I don't need you to like me or approve of me or revise your opinion of me for the whole town to see. I'm not interested in that transaction." She kept her voice even. "If you'd like to be civil neighbors, I'll be civil back. That's what I can offer." Lenora stared at her. "That's quite direct," Lenora said. "I know. I've been told that before." Mabel turned back to the wagon. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance." She heard Lenora's footsteps move away across the fairground grass, and she stood with her hand on the wagon board and let herself absorb the feeling of it. Not victory, which was what she might have wanted 6 months ago. Something more ambiguous and more real. The feeling of having needed something from someone for a long time, and discovering that you had stopped needing it at some point without noticing, and the need was gone, and the lack of it was its own kind of relief. Denny appeared at her shoulder. "You all right, ma'am?" "Load the last 2 pots," she said. He loaded the pots. Gideon came to find her when the wagon was loaded. He stood next to her for a moment in the cooling light of the late afternoon, looking at the fairground with the quiet of a man who had been on his feet since 4 in the morning and was now running on something beyond ordinary stamina. "Whitfield and Marsh both spoke to you?" he said. "They did." Whitfield had thanked her formally and asked questions about the supply approach that she'd answered fully because they were worth answering. Gerald Marsh had asked the same questions in more detail and written some of it down in a small notebook, which she'd watched with attention. "Marsh left his card," she said. "He says the Commission is interested in the approach to crisis provisioning. He used those words, crisis provisioning. He said the territory has other events that run into supply problems, and nobody manages them this way." Gideon looked at her. What does that mean for you? Nothing yet, she said. Maybe nothing at all. I don't have plans beyond getting home and sleeping for 12 hours. He almost smiled. We can do that. They climbed into the wagon, both of them wearing the residue of the day, flour and wood smoke and the particular exhaustion of people who had done something hard, and done it all the way through without stopping. The fairground fell away behind them. She had been in Wyoming for 4 months and 3 weeks. She had reorganized a household, worked accounts that uncovered theft, stood in a land office, and explained ledger entries to a man who hadn't wanted to understand them, attended a dinner in a dress she'd let out twice, and built a kitchen from scratch in a Wyoming wind in front of 400 people. She was not a woman anyone had expected. She was becoming, whether Harwick had planned for it or not, a woman it would remember. The wagon moved through the early evening, and the stars were beginning where they always did in Wyoming. First one, then several, then the whole extravagant spillage of them across a sky that didn't hedge its bets about anything. She was thinking about the look on that old man's face when he bit into the first apple hand pie. She was thinking about Ruth Gaines saying, "I wouldn't suggest it if I wasn't sure." She was thinking about Vernon on his bad knee working 3 hours past what any reasonable person would have asked of him. She was thinking about Gideon saying "my wife" to Gerald Marsh. She was thinking about all the things she had been certain she would not have on that train from Nebraska, and how many of them were real now in ways she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. Beside her on the wagon bench, Gideon said, 3 months. She looked at him. Before the end of the year, he said. If you're willing. I'd rather not wait longer than that. She looked at the road ahead. December, she said, after the first snow. December, he agreed. The horses moved under the Wyoming stars and the ranch light came into view at the end of the road. The same amber squares in the kitchen window that she'd left burning that morning before dawn, and she thought that light had traveled a long distance to become the thing that felt most like home. She had built today from next to nothing. She had built several things from next to nothing in the past 4 months. One more would not be beyond her. The first snow came on the 14th of December, which was a Thursday, which meant the wedding was on a Saturday, and Wyoming gave them exactly 48 hours of warning. Mabel stood at the kitchen window the morning the snow started and watched it come down in the particular way of early winter snow. Not dramatic, not a storm, just the sky quietly deciding it was time. And she thought about the fact that she had agreed to December after the first snow, and the first snow was here and there were 2 days. She was not frightened. She was something more complicated than frightened, something that didn't have a clean name. A woman standing at a window watching snow fall on a ranch that had become hers in every way that mattered before the legal fact of it caught up, and feeling the full weight of that reality settling into her bones like warmth from a fire that had been burning for a while, and she was only now letting herself sit close enough to feel. She put the kettle on. Gideon came downstairs at 6:15 later than usual, and she understood from the slight unfamiliarity of his movements that he had also been lying awake for part of the night. He was not a man who showed sleeplessness, obviously, but she had learned to read the small signs, the way he moved when everything was routine versus the way he moved when something was sitting differently in him. He looked at the window. Snow, he said. Since about 4, she said. He sat down. She poured his coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup the way he did on cold mornings and looked at the table. Saturday, he said. Saturday, she said. He drank his coffee. She made the eggs. They ate together in the kitchen while the snow came down outside, and the ordinary fact of 2 people eating breakfast together in a warm kitchen while winter arrived felt, to Mabel, like the most significant thing she'd been part of in a long time. Not because it was large, because it was real, and it was hers, and it had been built from a letter she'd almost not sent, and a train she'd almost not boarded, and a word she'd almost swallowed back down instead of saying aloud. She had spent her whole life almost not doing things because the world had trained her that a woman like her should not expect them. She was glad she'd sent the letter. The wedding was not what Harwick expected. Harwick, she had come to understand, expected events to perform themselves, to arrange into the shapes that social occasions were supposed to take, with the correct decorations and the correct gathering of important people and the correct sequence of formalities that allowed everyone present to know how to feel and when to feel it. What happened on the Saturday after the first snow of December was that Mabel Sutter married Gideon Rourke in the front room of Rourke Ranch with Vernon and Denny and Ruth Gaines and Agnes Purdy as witnesses, performed by the local magistrate rather than any figure of organized religion, in the dress she'd had made in October from a dark green wool she'd found at the dry goods store. Not the blue one she'd worn to Wyoming and to the Vance dinner, because that dress had carried enough history and deserved to rest. Agnes brought dried wildflowers from her house, which she'd pressed and tied with a ribbon. Mabel held them because Agnes had brought them, not because she'd planned for flowers. Denny wore his best shirt and had clearly attempted something with his hair. Vernon wore his good coat and stood with his hat in his hands throughout and looked like a man attending something he considered serious and worthwhile, which was the closest Vernon got to sentiment. It took less than 20 minutes. Afterward, Mabel made dinner. This was not a failure of romance. This was the most honest thing she could have done. She made the slow-cooked beef and the biscuits and the apple preserves, and she made a proper cake, a spice cake with a molasses glaze, from a recipe her mother had written on the back of an envelope that Mabel had carried in her traveling trunk from Nebraska. And they ate at the long kitchen table, all of them, the ranch hands included, because she had never seen any reason why the people who showed up every day and made the work possible should be excluded from the celebrating. Gideon sat at the head of the table and looked at the length of it, the food, the people, the noise, which was more noise than that kitchen had held in years. And he had an expression Mabel hadn't seen on him before. Not happiness exactly, because happiness on a face like Gideon's was too simple a word. Something more like a man discovering that a room he thought he knew had a door he hadn't found before, and finding out what was on the other side of it was something he hadn't known to want. She caught his eye across the table. He raised his coffee cup at her. She raised hers back. It was not a grand gesture. It was theirs, and that was better. The Carver-Hayes matter resolved itself in January, in the particular anticlimactic way that legal things sometimes resolve when the documentation is solid enough that fighting it becomes more expensive than settling it. Aldous Briggs filed the full record with the Territorial Land Commission in November, as promised, and Hayes spent 6 weeks attempting to have it dismissed through the connections Gideon had warned her about. What Hayes had not accounted for was that Gerald Marsh of the Agricultural Commission had been at the harvest gathering and had formed an opinion about Mabel Rourke's capacity for accurate documentation. And when the Hayes matter crossed Marsh's desk, he read the ledger pages with the attention of a man who trusted the work. The settlement was not public. These things rarely were. But Gideon came home one January evening with a folded letter from the Land Commission and set it on the kitchen table and said, "It's done." Mabel read the letter. She set it down. "He'll still be in the territory," she said. "He will," Gideon said. "He'll move his operations east. He won't come back to Harwick." "How do you know?" "Because the documentation is filed and it stays filed," Gideon said. "A man like Hayes doesn't fight battles he's already lost. He finds a new territory." She thought about Carver-Hayes on his horse in the ranch yard, trying to use his size as a reminder of what threat looked like. She thought about standing her ground with her shaking hands that he hadn't seen. "All right," she said. "Then it's done." She put the letter in the accounts folder where it belonged and made dinner. The idea for the dining house came from Gerald Marsh, which surprised her, and from Whitfield, which surprised her less. Marsh wrote in February with a formal letter that outlined an inquiry from the Territorial Commission regarding food provisioning at regional gatherings and events, and whether the methods Mabel had employed at the Harwick gathering were reproducible, and whether she had any interest in formalizing the operation. The letter was careful and official, and she read it 3 times before she understood that what it was actually asking, underneath the formal language, was whether she wanted a larger stage. Whitfield came in person, which was more direct and therefore more Whitfield. He arrived on a Tuesday in March with a proposition that involved him putting capital into a permanent structure in Harwick if the operation that ran inside it was managed by Mabel Rourke, because he had eaten her beef at the harvest gathering and conducted 6 profitable business conversations at her tables, and considered those 2 facts connected. She listened to Whitfield's entire proposition without interrupting him, which took some patience because Whitfield was not a brief man when he had capital at stake. Then she said, "I appreciate the offer, but I won't have an investor in this." Whitfield blinked. "I'm offering to fund the structure." "I understand what you're offering," she said, "and I understand why it seems straightforward to you. But an investor means a person with an interest in how decisions get made, and I won't have that." She kept her voice even. If there's a dining house, it's mine and Gideon's. The structure, the kitchen, the staff, the menu, the finances, ours. Whitfield looked at Gideon. Gideon said, "You heard her?" Whitfield looked back at Mabel. I was quiet for a moment, and she could see him recalculating, the way men of capital recalculate when they encounter something that doesn't fit the expected shape. Then he said, "You'd be turning down a significant amount of money." "Yes," Mabel said, "on principle." "On practicality," she said. "I've kept enough accounts to know what happens to operations that answer to outside money. The outside money always has opinions, and eventually those opinions cost more than the money was worth." Whitfield was quiet for a moment longer. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A real one, not a social laugh. "All right," he said. "All right, Mrs. Rourke." He stood up and picked up his hat. "When you open, I'll be your first paying customer." "We'll hold a table," she said. After he left, Gideon sat at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the middle distance. "We'll need to borrow from Dorset," he said, "to build the structure without Whitfield's capital." "I know," Mabel said. "I've already run the numbers. We can service a Dorset loan inside of 3 years if the first year goes the way I think it will." He looked at her. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the harvest gathering," she said. "Since Marsh asked me questions and wrote things in his notebook." She sat down across from him. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure it was real yet. You don't plan around things that might not be real." "It's real," he said. "I know that now." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "What do you need from me?" "The beef supply," she said. "Your distribution contacts for transport. And the lot on Crail Street. I know you own it. It's the right location." He looked at her. "You knew I owned the Crail Street lot?" "I've been through all the property records," she said. "I keep accounts, Gideon." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. "Yes, you do." He looked at the table for a moment. "You could have done this without me." She considered that honestly. "I could have done parts of it without you," she said. "I couldn't have done all of it. The lot, the beef supply, the contacts, those are yours. And I didn't come to Wyoming to do things alone." He held her gaze. "Equal partners." "Equal partners," she said. They shook hands across the kitchen table, which was not the romantic gesture of stories, but was the exact right gesture for the two of them. Direct and real, and carrying the specific weight of a promise made between people who meant what they said. The Rourke table opened in the first week of September, a year and 4 months after Mabel had stepped off a train in Harwick with a traveling trunk and a prepared speech about gracious exits she'd never had to use. The building on Crail Street was not grand. She had not wanted grand. She had wanted solid and warm and the kind of place that felt like it had been there longer than it had, which was a quality that came from good materials and careful planning rather than money spent on appearance. There were 12 tables. There was a kitchen large enough to do real work in, built to her specifications. The storage positioned correctly. The ventilation designed for actual cooking rather than aesthetics. The workspace proportioned for how cooking actually happened rather than how it looked. She hired 4 people to start. Ruth Gaines, who had proved her judgment 6 times over during the harvest gathering and who needed the work since her husband's farm had taken losses in the winter. A young woman named Petra, 17, who had come to Mabel's kitchen door in August looking for work and who had the quality Mabel valued most in kitchen workers. She listened to instruction once and did not need to hear it again. A man named Callum, who could manage the front room and talk to people the way Mabel sometimes could not, with the easy sociability of someone for whom it cost nothing. And a woman named Harriet, not Mrs. Harriet Poole, who cleaned the ranch, but a different Harriet, a widow of 48 who had been turned down by the hotel kitchen for being too old and who could bake with a consistency that Mabel recognized as years of practice. She hired Harriet on the day she came in after tasting 1 biscuit. "When can you start?" Mabel said. Yet Harriet looked like a woman who had been told no so many times that yes took a moment to register. "Tomorrow," she said. "If you mean it." "I mean it," Mabel said. "Tomorrow, 6 o'clock." Harriet was there at 5:45. The opening was not an event. Mabel had specifically declined to make it an event, because events invited the kind of attention that made people come to see rather than to eat. And she wanted the first people through the door to be people who came because they were hungry and wanted a meal, not because they wanted to watch the large woman from Nebraska succeed or fail. The first person through the door on the first morning was Whitfield, as promised. He sat at a table by the window and ordered the beef and the biscuits and the coffee and ate without looking up, with the focused concentration of a man doing something he considers worth doing properly. When he left, he stopped at the door and looked back at her. 3 years, he said, and then I want to talk again about what this could be. 3 years, she said. Come back then. He left. The next 3 tables filled within an hour. By the end of the first week, the noon meal was requiring a wait. By the end of the first month, she had added 2 more tables and adjusted the kitchen sequence to handle the volume. By December, a year after the wedding, a year after the first snow, she had served over 2,000 meals, and the accounts showed what she had told Gideon they would show. A first year that was exceeding her estimates by a margin. She had been careful not to plan around because she had not wanted to assume. She showed him the numbers on the kitchen table of the ranch house on a Tuesday evening, the same table where she had shown him the first account's discrepancy, the same table where Hayes's invoice records had been spread out, the same table where they had agreed to equal partners with a handshake. He looked at the figures for a long time. You were right, he said, about the 3-year loan. I usually am, she said. About numbers. He looked up at her. You knew this was going to work. I knew the cooking was going to work, she said. The business. I was less certain, but the numbers are holding. She closed the ledger. We should talk about the second Petra. The second Petra? There's a girl who's been coming by the kitchen door for 3 weeks, Mabel said. Name's Lena, 14 years old, mother's been sick, she needs work. She's been watching through the window. Gideon was quiet. You're going to hire a 14-year-old. I'm going to train her, Mabel said. Same as Petra. Same as I would have wanted someone to do for me at 14 if I'd had anywhere to go. He looked at her. How many people are you going to bring in? As many as need it and can do the work, she said simply. That was always the plan. He thought about that. I didn't know that was the plan. I didn't tell you everything at once, she said. You would have had opinions. He made the laugh sound. Probably. I needed the thing to be running before you had opinions about the edges of it. That's very calculated. I keep accounts, she said. I'm a calculated person. He shook his head, but it was the head shake of a man who is not actually objecting. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. A simple thing. He didn't do gestures elaborately, and she had learned to take the simple things at their full value, which was considerable. It's a good plan, he said. All of it. She turned her hand over under his. I know, she said. What she thought about in the quiet of the autumn evening a year after the Rourke table opened. Sitting in the kitchen of the ranch house after closing, which she still did most evenings because the ranch house was home and the dining house on Crail Street was work, and she had been careful to keep those things distinct, was the letter. The letter she had almost not sent. She thought about this woman who had written it, 33 years old, sitting in a boarding house in Lincoln, with 12 men to feed and a limited future, and the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from overwork, but from underestimation. The woman who had written down everything she could do and then, because she was that woman and not any other kind, had added the honest paragraph about what she looked like and what she was not. She thought about what that woman had been afraid of. Not the train, not Wyoming, not even Gideon Rourke, whom she hadn't known well enough yet to be afraid of. She had been afraid of arriving, of getting off that train and being seen and having her own clear-eyed assessment of herself confirmed by someone else's eyes. The assessment that said you are too much, you are not enough, you are the wrong shape for the life you want. She had been afraid that the world was right about her. She had been wrong about being afraid of that. The world is not right about people. The world is a rough assessor, a quick judge, a thing that looks at surfaces because surfaces are what it can see from a distance, and it makes its decisions fast because waiting takes patience that crowds don't have. The world had looked at Mabel Sutter on a train platform in Wyoming and seen a large woman in a blue dress who did not meet its requirements. The world had been wrong about almost everything important. She was not too much. She was exactly the right amount for the work she had to do, for the kitchen she had built, for the man who came home earlier than he needed to because something at the ranch was worth coming home to. She was exactly the right amount for Lena, who now came through the kitchen door at 5:30 every morning and was learning to bake bread with the focused seriousness of a girl who understood that this skill was a form of security that no one could take from her. For Harriet, who was 50 now and had stopped flinching when strangers walked in the door. For Ruth Gaines, who had her own station in the Rourke table kitchen and ran it the way she ran everything, quietly, thoroughly, without needing to be thanked. The people who had told Mabel she was too much had always meant she was too much for their comfort, not for her own life. Her life had needed all of her, and then some. She heard the front door of the ranch house open and Gideon's boots on the floor, and she heard him hang his coat and hat on the hook, and she heard him come through to the kitchen and stop in the doorway the way he sometimes did, just standing there for a moment, looking at the kitchen with her in it. "You're late," she said. She was making tea, not because she'd expected him at any specific time, but because she made tea in the evenings, and the fact of his arriving did not require her to stop. "Dorset wanted to talk about the spring expansion," he said. He sat down at the table. "I told him it was your decision." "It's our decision," she said. "You know what I mean." She did. He meant that she would make the financial assessment, and he trusted it, and whatever she concluded he would back without requiring her to argue the case extensively. It was one of the ways Gideon Rourke had turned out to be a different kind of man than the world had trained her to expect. Not that he deferred to her, but that he took her judgment as seriously as she took his, and in 2 years of shared accounts and shared decisions that had not once required renegotiation. She brought 2 cups of tea to the table and sat across from him. "The spring expansion," she said. "You think we're ready?" "I think Dorset thinks we're ready," he said. "I think the numbers say we're ready. I think you've thought about it already and probably have a page of notes somewhere." She reached into her apron pocket and put a folded page on the table. He looked at it and back at her. "2 pages," she said. "Folded." He unfolded it. He read it. He read it again, which meant something in it had caught him. He looked up. "You want to add a second kitchen." "Not a second dining room," she said. "A separate kitchen for the event provisioning. The Marsh Commission has sent 3 more letters. The Caldwell Gathering inquiry never went away. They sent Agnes in November, and Agnes in October is very persistent." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "If we're doing both, they need to be separate operations. Same supply chain, separate workflows." He was quiet. He was reading the second page. "The second kitchen would run under Ruth," she said. "She can manage it. She's been managing it informally every time we've had an event inquiry." "Ruth knows about this?" "Ruth has known for 4 months," Mabel said. "I wanted to see if she could handle the volume before I put it on paper." "And?" "She can," Mabel said. "She handled the Morley event in October without me and brought it in under budget." Gideon folded the pages and set them on the table. He had the expression she recognized now, the one that meant he had already made up his mind and was simply letting the stated logic catch up to the concluded decision. "Tell Dorset yes," he said. She nodded. She picked up her tea. I was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, "Do you remember the first morning?" She knew which morning. "The cornbread." "The cornbread," he said, "and the flour in the wrong corner." "You didn't know you had dried thyme," she said. "I didn't know a lot of things," he said. He looked up at her. "I didn't know what I was getting when I wrote that letter back." "Neither did I," she said. "I thought I was getting a practical arrangement with a reasonable man." "And?" She looked at him across the table, the man who carried trunks without being asked, and handed over the smokehouse keys without hesitation, and said, "Don't look at me." She did this in front of a fairground full of people and married her on a December Saturday after the first snow and shook her hand across this same table and meant every single word he'd ever said to her. "I got a reasonable man," she said. He smiled. "The real one, not the almost one. That's all?" "And the dried thyme," she said. He laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that filled the kitchen, real and unguarded, the laugh of a man who had stopped holding the house at a distance. And she laughed too, because it was that kind of kitchen now, the kind where laughter was part of what got made. The Rourke table ran for many years. Lena learned to bake bread, and then learned the accounts, and eventually learned to manage the books for the event kitchen, while Mabel focused on the dining house. Harriet trained 3 more women after Petra and the second Petra, all of them brought to the kitchen door by the specific gravity of a place that was known in the territory for hiring women that other places had declined. Ruth Gaines ran the event provisioning operation with a competence that stopped surprising people after the first 2 years and became simply the thing Ruth did, the way competence becomes invisible when it is consistent enough. Whitfield came back at the 3-year mark, as promised. He made his proposal again. Mabel said no again in different words. He said, "Stubborn woman." She said, "Accurate accountant." He laughed and ordered the beef and left her a larger tip than was customary, which she distributed between Callum and the kitchen staff the way she distributed everything, equally, without ceremony, because it was the right thing to do, and right things did not require ceremony. Agnes Purdy ate at the Rourke table every Thursday noon for 11 years, until her health made the trip from her house difficult, at which point Mabel began sending a meal to Agnes's house on Thursdays with Denny, who was not 19 anymore, and whose ears had finally stopped going red, and who had turned into a dependable young man with a good heart that Mabel took a private satisfaction in having had some small part in not ruining. The Carver-Hayes matter stayed filed. Hayes moved his operations east, and the territory was not worse for his absence. Lenora Vance was civil. Mabel was civil back. It was not a friendship. It did not need to be. And Gideon came home earlier than he needed to every evening for all the years that followed, because something at the ranch was worth coming home to, and he was a man who finally understood what worth coming home to actually meant, and did not take it for granted, which is rarer than it should be, and more important than most people say. There is a thing that nobody tells you about being underestimated for most of your life. They don't tell you that the underestimation becomes a kind of calibration, after enough time, that you learn to measure your own worth by how much resistance you meet, and you stop expecting things to be given and start expecting to build them, which is harder and slower, and less comfortable than being simply seen for what you are from the beginning. But there is something in that building. Mabel Sutter had built a household from neglect, and a business from a catastrophe, and a marriage from a plain, honest letter, and a life from a traveling trunk with everything she owned inside it. None of it had been given. All of it had been earned in the specific way that things earned through difficulty are earned, with the full knowledge of their cost and the full right to their possession. She had been told, in various ways across her 33 years, that she was too large, too plain, too ordinary, too much and not enough simultaneously, which is the particular cruelty of the world's assessment of women it has decided not to accommodate. She had been wrong to half believe it. The believing was the only thing she had ever gotten wrong. On a Thursday evening in the autumn of her 3rd year of marriage, she found Gideon alone in the dining house after closing. He sometimes came in at the end of service to help close up, and sometimes he stayed after, sitting at the table by the window that got the last of the light, eating whatever was left from the day's service with the quiet appreciation of a man who had never once in 3 years taken a meal in that kitchen for granted. I was eating apple pie. She stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and watched him, this man who had answered her letter and carried her trunk and handed her the keys to things without being asked, and she thought about the first letter she had sent, the honest one, the one she had written late at night in Lincoln with her heart in her throat. She said, "I warned you." He looked up. "In the first letter," she said, "I told you I wasn't pretty, just big and stubborn and good in a kitchen." He set his fork down. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since the beginning, the full, specific, attentive look of a man who saw what was in front of him and had never once required it to be different. "I know what you told me," he said. "And?" He rose from the table and came across the room toward her and took both her hands in his and held them, the way he held things he meant to keep. "When you stepped off that train," he said, "I saw a woman trying very hard not to look afraid." He said it quietly, plainly, the way he said all the true things. "And then I watched you fix every broken thing in my house and challenge every wrong thing in this town and build a business from a collapsed shed and a Wyoming wind and make a kitchen out of nothing twice and hire women that everyone else said no to, and stand in a yard and tell Carver-Hayes to his face that the numbers don't lie." She was very still. "Mabel," he said, "you were never too much for me." He held her gaze. "I was living with too little before you came. I just didn't know what the difference felt like." She felt her eyes fill and did not apologize for it, because she was not a woman who apologized for the true things anymore. "All of me?" she said. All of you, he said. I wouldn't know what to do with less. Outside the dining house on Crail Street, Harwick went about its evening. The merchants closing their doors, the cattle hands riding in from the pastures, the lights coming on in the hotel windows, and the schoolhouse, and the houses along the main road. The territory was settling into autumn the way it always did, with the specific beautiful indifference of country that does not arrange itself for anyone. Inside, Mabel Rourke stood in the kitchen she had built, and held the hands of the man she had built a life with and understood, finally and completely, that the world had been wrong about her all along, and that she had spent enough years knowing that and acting on it, that the knowing had long since become the living. She had cooked her way into this territory. She had accounted her way through its complications. She had fed its people and documented its dishonesty and stood her ground in its yard and built her name into its record. Not because she had set out to prove something, because she had set out to live, fully and as herself. And living fully turns out to require exactly that, showing up in your entirety, taking up the space you actually occupy, doing the work that is in front of you with everything you have. The apple pie was still on the table. She sat down and finished it. It was exactly right. Gideon sat back down across from her and watched her eat the last of the pie with the particular attention he gave. Things he found worth watching, and after a moment he reached over and cut himself the piece she'd left. She had, without thinking, left exactly the right amount for one more serving, which was the kind of thing she did without knowing she did it anymore. And they sat together in the empty dining house in the last of the evening light and ate in the comfortable quiet of people who had run out of things to prove to each other. Outside, the first suggestion of winter was in the air. Not cold yet, just the edge of it, the way October in Wyoming put its hand on your shoulder to let you know what was coming. Vernon's knee is getting worse, Gideon said. I know, Mabel said. He won't say so. He wouldn't. I've been putting a footrest under the kitchen table on the side where he sits, she said. He hasn't mentioned it. Gideon looked at her. He noticed. I know he noticed. He told Denny it was the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for him in 20 years, Gideon said. Denny told me. Vernon would never tell you himself. Mabel set her fork down. I know that too. She thought about Vernon, 57 now, still moving through the ranch with that measured pace that covered more ground than it appeared to, still arriving everywhere slightly early so nobody saw him struggle. She thought about what it meant to carry something quietly for years because the alternative was asking for help, and you had been a man in a hard country for a long time, and asking for help was not a language that came naturally. She understood that language. She had spoken it herself for 33 years before Wyoming. I want to offer him the foreman's quarters, she said, formally. Not as a charity, as a recognition that he's been running that operation in practice for 3 years, and he should have the title and the accommodation that goes with it. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He'll push back. He'll push back, she agreed. And then he'll accept because he's a practical man and the practical argument is sound. She looked at her husband. Will you back me on it? Yes, Gideon said, without hesitation. She picked up her fork again. They stayed in the dining house until the light was fully gone from the window, which was later than either of them usually stayed because neither of them was in a hurry, and the kitchen was warm and the pie was good, and there are evenings in a life that you recognize while they are happening as the kind you will want to remember, not because anything extraordinary is occurring, but because everything ordinary is exactly right. Mabel recognized this one. She filed it away in the place she kept such things, the same place she kept the memory of the first morning in the kitchen with the cornbread and the smell of coffee, and Denny's involuntary expression when he tasted it, and the sound of Gideon laughing in the kitchen the first real time, and Agnes Purdy touching her arm on the fairground without needing to make it into a speech. The small true things. The ones that didn't perform themselves. Spring arrived with more trouble than usual, which Wyoming considered a reasonable default. The trouble came in the form of a letter from the territorial capital, addressed to Mrs. Mabel Rourke of the Rourke Table, Harwick, from an office she hadn't corresponded with before. The Commissioner of Territorial Markets, a man named Aldred, who had apparently been reading Gerald Marsh's reports with interest for 2 years, and had decided that interest warranted a formal inquiry. The letter asked whether Mrs. Rourke would be willing to consult with the Commission on the matter of sustainable food provisioning at large territorial events, drawing on the methods she had developed and demonstrated at the Harwick Harvest Gathering and at subsequent regional events through the Rourke Table Event Kitchen. It was, in the careful language of official letters, an invitation to be taken seriously by people with the authority to make that seriousness consequential. She read it at the kitchen table of the ranch house on a Tuesday morning, and then set it down and went back to her tea and thought about it for a long time. Gideon came in from the yard and saw the letter and her face. "Capital?" he said. "Capital," she said. He poured himself coffee and sat down and read the letter. He read it twice. He set it down. "What do you want to do?" he said. She thought about what she wanted, not what was practical, not what was strategically sound, what she actually wanted. "I want to go," she said. "I want to sit in that commission office and tell them what I know about provisioning and crisis management and building kitchens from nothing in bad conditions, and I want them to write it down and use it somewhere useful." She looked at him. "Is that arrogant?" "It's accurate," he said. "I was asking if it was arrogant." "Same answer," he said. She almost smiled. She picked up the letter. "I'll need 3 days in the capital. Ruth can manage the dining house. The event kitchen doesn't have anything scheduled until June." "I'll come with you," Gideon said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to be there when they realize what they've sent for." She looked at him across the table. "You're proud of me," she said. She said it plainly, not as a question, just naming a thing she could see. "I've been proud of you since the second morning," he said. "When you moved the flour to the right corner without saying anything about it. That's a specific thing to remember." "I remember specific things," he said, "about you in particular." She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket where she kept things that needed acting on. They went to the capital in late April, which was the kind of spring trip that reminded her how large the territory was and how much of it she hadn't seen. She spent 3 days in an official building with men who had spent their careers thinking about commerce and agriculture at a large scale, and she told them, in the plain language she had always used for things she understood, what she had learned about feeding large numbers of people under difficult conditions. She told them about planning for failure, about backup supply chains and contingency menus, and the difference between a provisioning operation that could absorb a problem and one that collapsed at the first variance. She told them about the harvest gathering, the full truth of it, the broken shed and the wind and the outdoor kitchen built from ranch equipment, the specific sequence decisions she'd made and why. She told them about Ruth Gaines managing the Morley event under budget without Mabel present, because she had built the system to run without her, and that was what a system was supposed to do. They wrote things down. Marsh was in the room, and she caught him nodding at specific points in the way of a man hearing his own notes confirmed by the primary source. On the second day, one of the commissioners, a man named Felt, older, with the careful manner of someone who had been doing important things for a long time and had learned to be skeptical of people who overstated their case, asked her a question she hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "how did you develop the confidence to propose taking over the Harwick supper, given the circumstances at the time?" She thought about that honestly. "I didn't have confidence," she said. "I had competence. They're not the same thing. Confidence is a feeling. Competence is a record." She looked at him steadily. "I knew what I'd done before. I knew what the supply list could support. I knew my people and what they could execute. I proposed it because the evidence said it was possible, not because I felt certain." A pause. "I was not certain, but uncertainty about feeling is different from uncertainty about capacity, and I had learned not to confuse the two." Felt wrote that down. When they left the capital on the third day, Gideon walked beside her down the steps of the commission building into the April morning and said nothing for half a block and then said, "Felt wrote down what you said about confidence and competence." "I noticed," Mabel said. "He doesn't write things down often. Agnes Purdy told me that once when she dealt with the commission on event permitting. She said Felt's pen stays in his pocket for most of a meeting." Mabel walked for a moment. "It's a true distinction," she said. "I've spent my whole life having people tell me I wasn't confident enough, when what they actually meant was that I wasn't performing certainty in the way they expected. Performing certainty I didn't have seemed dishonest." "It is dishonest," Gideon said. "A lot of people do it anyway." "Yes," he said. "And a lot of things go wrong because of it." She thought about Carver Hayes, whose entire operation had been built on performed certainty and whose numbers had not held up to a woman with a pencil and a clean ledger page. She thought about what certainty that had no competence underneath it actually cost in the end when the evidence came due. "Let's go home," she said. They went home. The foreman conversation with Vernon happened on a Wednesday evening in May, in the yard of Rourke Ranch, with Gideon present and Mabel doing most of the talking because it was her proposal and she believed in standing behind her own proposals. Vernon listened with his hat in his hands and his expression doing the careful, neutral thing it did when he was feeling more than he intended to show. When she finished, he said, "I don't need a title." "I know you don't need it," Mabel said. "I need you to have it. The ranch needs it to be formal, and the quarters need to be yours because you've earned them, and your knee has needed a ground floor room for 2 years, and we've all pretended not to notice for 2 years, and I am finished pretending." Vernon looked at her. He looked at Gideon. Gideon said, "She's right. About all of it." Vernon turned his hat over in his hands once. "The footrest was you," he said to Mabel. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I'll take the quarters." He put his hat back on. "Thank you, Mrs. Rourke." "Vernon," she said. "Ma'am." "You've been calling me Mrs. Rourke for 2 years. You can call me Mabel." He looked at her. Something moved across his weathered face. Not quite a smile, but the deep country version of one, the kind that took years of Wyoming to understand. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked back toward the barn on his bad knee, steadily, without hurrying. Mabel looked at Gideon. Gideon said, "He called you ma'am again." "He'll call me ma'am until one of us dies," she said, but he meant it differently that time. She was right. He had. Years later, when people who came through Harwick asked about the Rourke table, asked how it had started, what it had grown from, why travelers made a point of stopping there when the road could have taken them straight through, the answer they got depended on who they asked. If they asked Denny, who was foreman by then, and ran the ranch operation with the steady hand of a man who had learned what things were worth from people worth learning from, he said. Mabel had walked into a broken household and fixed it the way she fixed everything, which was by seeing clearly and working hard and not making a fuss about either. If they asked Ruth Gaines, who ran 3 event kitchens across 2 territories by the time her hair had gone fully gray, she said Mabel was the only person she had ever worked for who treated competence as the only qualification that mattered, and that it turned out competence was not as common as it should be, and Mabel was very good at finding it in unexpected places. If they asked Harriet, who had stayed with the Rourke Table Kitchen for 9 years before her hands made the work too difficult, and who had trained more women in that kitchen than she could accurately count, she said a simple thing, that Mabel Rourke had said yes when every other door had said no, and that some people changed your life by the size of what they gave you, and some changed it by the simple fact of not turning you away, and that the second kind was rarer and mattered more. If they asked Gideon, he pointed toward the kitchen. He always pointed toward the kitchen. And then he said, the same way he always said it, with the slight turn at the corner of his mouth that meant he was about to say something true and was allowing himself to enjoy saying it, "She told me she could cook." And then he looked at his wife through the kitchen doorway, the large, plain, extraordinary woman from Nebraska who had walked into his broken house and filled it with warmth and competence and the smell of dried thyme and the sound of real laughter and the specific gravity of a person who knew exactly what she was worth and had stopped apologizing for it. And he said the rest. She forgot to mention she could rebuild a man's whole life. And Mabel, who could hear perfectly well from the kitchen, and always could, did not turn around. But she smiled. She had been smiling, in one way or another, since December after the first snow, since a Saturday morning in a front room with dried wildflowers, and a green wool dress, and a magistrate reading words that made official what had already been true for months. She had come to Wyoming with a prepared speech about gracious exits and a traveling trunk, and the particular courage of a woman who had decided that the world's assessment of her was not the final word on the subject. She had been right. The world is not the final word on anyone. The final word belongs to the person who shows up anyway, who boards the train, sends the honest letter, moves the flower to the right corner, stands in the yard and doesn't flinch, builds the kitchen in the wind, feeds the 400, shakes the hand across the table, says yes and means it, and does the work. The final word is always the work. Mabel Rourke knew that better than most. She turned back to the stove. There was dinner to make.